ever held virtually. We are missing seeing each of you in a room with us, but we greatly appreciate you have taken the time to be here now, wherever you might be viewing this from. I'm Julie Woodward with the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, and I have the honor of being the chair of the annual meeting this year, along with an amazing team that has helped put all of this together. While we're excited to get underway with the annual meeting, we do want to pause for a minute and acknowledge what a challenging year this has been. From when we decided to postpone this meeting back in April, and the forest sector, full of all the essential workers, started to navigate its way through a global pandemic, to the social unrest and bringing to light racial injustice, and most recently, the catastrophic wildfires touching over 1 million acres of our treasured Oregon forest. This has been a hard year for each of us being impacted in a different way. But here we are together for this day and tomorrow, sharing a common thread of hope and discussing together how forestry is a sustainable solution. If you could think about, this is not the first time the profession of forestry has faced challenges. If we go back when SAF started in 1900, Gifford Pinchot gathered 7 foresters in his office with the goal to bring together forestry professionals to further the cause of forestry in America by fostering that spirit of camaraderie among foresters and by creating opportunities for a free interchange of views about forestry. Gifford Pinchot probably didn't think one day this exchange might happen quite in this format, but in the spirit of that first meeting and those meetings since then, there's been a lot of challenges these last 120 years. Let us learn from those and be inspired from one another for the challenges that we currently face. I hope you can set aside some of the craziness of life right now and engage with all these sessions over the next 2 days. We ask for your grace and patience with us as we try out this new format, but encourage you to ask questions, post in the chat, stay engaged, and in the end, know that forestry is a sustainable solution. I'd like to also welcome Jeff Grogan, who's our 2020 SAF chair for Oregon, and ask Jeff to say a few words. Yes, I know he was on here.
Yes, good morning. Thanks, Julie.
Good morning, Jeff.
Hi, yep, can you hear me okay?
We can, yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Great.
Love to hear welcome.
Okay, there we go. I think I'm live now. Yes, good morning, thank you. And I would like to welcome everyone again to our first ever all virtual 2020 annual meeting. So yeah, so as Julie mentioned, I'm the 2020 Oregon State SAF chair. And those of you who don't know me, my day job is a planning forester for the Weyerhaeuser Company in our South Oregon region. So I work out of our Eugene, Oregon office. And I've been an SAF member since 1993, Forest Management at OSU, so the student chapter is when I started, and SAF certified forester since 2002. So long history, and yeah, I was thinking about that yesterday on my drive home about all the changes that we've seen, and seems to be constant, right? But always challenges to move forward. But SAF has always been there and moving forward. So excited to be here. Excited to have the meeting. OSAF annual meeting is really, our organization's flagship event to come together as a state society. Recognize outstanding work by our members and chapters. Reconnect with colleagues, make new connections, and really learn about these new topics in forest management. And so, new format, but we're still going to try to stick to those goals as we do this meeting. I'd like to say a big thank you to the Capital chapter and of course all the annual meeting committees for continuing to stick with this meeting. Right, as you know, most of you know, we normally hold the meetings in April, our annual meetings, and the team has made several location, programming, logistical changes due to COVID-19 and the other challenges that Julie mentioned. Really the state, executive committee, we really did not want to cancel our meeting, and Julie Woodward really stepped up, kind of in our new world, and kept the committees going, organized, motivated, I'm sure, and really set the bar high, right, for what we want to do and what we can accomplish, and in online meetings and future annual meetings. So really looking forward to seeing how this goes. Sponsors are going to be out there, so big thank you for the sponsors of this event and their continued support of Oregon SAF. I would encourage you to please thank your employer, colleagues, or other contacts at these organizations, and I think we'll be showing those throughout the meeting, but they're also on pages 4 to 6 of the program that should be made available to you. And speaking of the program, right, really excited what we have lined up over the next day and a half. You know, Forestry, the sustainable solution. Excited that we're starting with wildlife and forest management on day 1, and then really diving into the more timely topics of fire and water on day 2. You know, earlier this year we were, you know, in major discussions about Oregon Forest Practices Act and stream and water. So I think that's a lot of where those topics came from. And, you know, most recently these devastating wildfires that we've seen in the past month. So really pivoted to get those on the topic and make those a relevant program for us. This meeting is another great example of SAF and really the mission that we're trying to do. You know, we set the standard in forest management, bringing science, best practice, and the best people together to actively shape the future of our profession. And lastly, I would like to make another plug for membership. If you are a member, highly encourage you to continue your SAF and your Oregon SAF membership. Can't emphasize enough, your membership matters. It allows us to bring you the scientific journals, you know, the Journal of Forestry, Forest Science, the Forestry Source periodical, email newsletters, plus with our local OSAF membership, you know, our very own Western Forester, which is really looked upon highly across the nation, really, about timely topics to keep us informed about current forest practices, policies, and best ways that we can accomplish our daily tasks. Membership also gives us a voice at state and national policy issues, right? Locally and at national level, so it does important. I would also ask you to, you know, members to actively advertise the benefits of SAF, you know, like this meeting or other virtual things that we have out there, to your employers, employees, you know, even your contractors, and also let us know how we can do better to support our members. If you're not an SAF member, you know, we want you in our community. You know, all forestry and natural resource management students and graduates are eligible for membership in SAF. And we need you to help actively shape our profession and really encourage us for a diversity of ideas, really to help us manage our natural resources as we move forward in these interesting times. So with that, I think I'll pass it back to Julie and we can get this meeting started.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for the words, and really appreciate all you've done too for the Society this year. So as Jeff mentioned, we do really appreciate all the work of the Capital Chapter and all the leaders at SAF, and excited to bring this to you. A couple things we just wanted to share, some finer details as we navigate this meeting together. The first is, hopefully you received this program that you see, the front cover of it here. You should have got it by email. It's also available on the website, theforestry.org. If you go to the event page, you can download it there. Really encourage you to print it out, keep it handy. It has the agenda in it. It also has all the biographies of the presenters, so some great background information there. As mentioned, it has our sponsors, who we really appreciate all of our generous donations and sponsors. You know, those allow us to really be successful and help keep this society going too, with all the great outreach we do. We also are going to have our award recipients recognized tomorrow at noon, and we shared those people with you in the program because we really want to make sure you get a chance to thank them. It's a little bit different when you don't get to just walk up and shake their hand. So reach out and also you know, not only thank them for all they've done, but give them a congratulations. So we also want to make sure everyone's familiar with a little bit of the control functions of Zoom. Zoom webinar is a little bit different. What you probably notice is that you don't have quite as many functions as a full Zoom meeting, but you also, if you're not presenting, you don't have ability to use your microphone or camera. Later today, we're going to turn on some of those options, but the best way for you to get information to us is if you have questions, on the bottom you'll see that Q&A button, and you can type in your questions there anytime as we go along, and the moderators will read those and try and get through as many questions as we can at the end of each session. And then the chat button, that's if you have some general comments or you have something that's not you know, a question for the session, but something you want to just share out with everyone, or if you have a technical type question, please feel free to put that in the chat box. And then the raise hand, we're using that for more for this afternoon. If you have in the student and chapter sessions, if you want to request your microphone to be turned on, then you will use that raise hand. If you have an immediate need, again, feel free to just send a chat and one of us will respond. We have a lot of behind the scenes helper, Mike Klausey, Bonnie Glendining, Fran and Cafferata Coe, and many people that are helping out behind the scenes. I also want to give a shout out to the Northwest office, Melinda and Andrea Watts. And Andrea came on mid-year here and helped us out, and Lori Razor was helping as well. So a lot of great work that went into this, and we're excited to launch our program. And I want to, at this point, introduce to you Fran Cafferata Coe. And many of you know Fran, but she's going to be our moderator for our Wildlife in the News session. And Fran is a consulting certified wildlife biologist, and she's also the owner of Cafferata Consulting. She consults for a variety of organizations, including numerous family forest landowners and companies of different sizes. Fran has helped develop wildlife programs for over 500,000 acres in Western Oregon and Washington. And Fran is really passionate about providing outreach and communication that brings forestry and wildlife professionals together to develop practical management strategies. And as mentioned, we see a lot of wildlife here lately in the news, and that can help, or is often sometimes drives management decisions. And so we just want opportunity to get current research and have some discussions around where that intersects with forestry. So Fran, I'm excited for you to take over as the moderator and appreciate all your time you put into this session.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie, for that introduction and for working so hard to pull off this virtual meeting. I guess time will tell to see if we do pull it off, but that's our plan. And I'm so excited, like Jeff said, that we're kicking off the OSAF meeting with a wildlife session. That's the first time ever that we've started. We've had wildlife sessions before, but not kicking off the whole meeting with it. So that really is exciting. We'd hope to have the seminar as well as a wildlife tour for this meeting, but I think that we're going to accomplish both with the program that we've put together for you. We combine the tour and the classroom talks to bring you a variety of wildlife topics that are relevant to forest management and certainly are part of what it means to have a sustainable solution for forestry. And so, like Julie said, you'll find all the speaker bios in the program, and so I invite you to read those as time allows. And we have a really tight program for you, and so I will be quite brief in my introductions of each of our speakers, but you can read their full bio in the program. So without further delay, let's just get started with the program. So our first speaker is Dr. Paul Henson, and Paul is the State Supervisor for the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and I see he's got his video started. Paul, are you ready to share your screen?
I am.
Awesome. It's all yours.
Well, thank you. Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Fran and Julie and the Society of American Foresters for the Oregon chapter for inviting me to kick this off. It is exciting when we get the forestry folks talking about wildlife, and so I really support that approach. And again, thank you for that. I guess I'm just going to talk pretty briefly. I have about a dozen slides I'll go through pretty quick on sort of big picture on some forest species issues and collaborative management efforts. And I want to make the point, and we'll hopefully conclude on the same point, that the Fish and Wildlife Service's forest management collaborative approach has evolved a lot since the early spotted owl days. And I'm sure in the meeting here, there's a lot of folks who started their careers or maybe were well into their careers when the spotted owl was listed, as well as many younger folks who've joined since that period, and that's pretty much in the Northwest anyway, maybe the only kind of management paradigm they are familiar with when it comes to some of the wildlife issues. So I want to talk about how we've gone beyond that. And in doing that, I'm just going to give updates on a variety of other species in addition to the spotted owl. The red tree vole, the coastal marten, the Pacific fisher, the spotted owl, and the barred owl issue, and then some other species, which are going to be kind of unusual, I think, to some folks in the meeting here today. And then talk about our habitat conservation plans, HCPs, and CCAAs, Canada Conservation Agreements with Assurances, which we've been doing for several forest species now with private and state folks. So first on the tree vole, I'm sure many of the foresters know what this critter is. Recently, last December, we made a decision to not list that species. We had been petitioned, and we actually had found it to originally be warranted, but some additional surveys and information led us to change that position and make a final decision that it was not warranted for listing. As often is the case, whether we decide to list something or not list it under the Endangered Species Act, a petitioner or a stakeholder disagrees and looks to file a lawsuit. That's looks like that will be the case here. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, we have an active working group of federal, state, tribal, and some private folks doing a preliminary work on developing a conservation strategy for red tree vole. Moving on to coastal marten. This is very timely because any day now you should see a listing decision to list the distinct population segment, or DPS, of the coastal marten as threatened with a 4D rule. And that should be coming out in the Federal Register any day. We did make the announcement later at the end of the summer, a month and a half ago or so, but things in the Federal Register have been fairly slow getting out. We will be proposing critical habitat sometime later, early next year for this species. And that's a map showing parts of Oregon and California where this DPS is known to occur. It's had a greatly reduced range from its historic range. The light blue is the historic range, and the darker gray blue is where we know the species is currently extant. I'll take a few minutes to just discuss what a 4D rule is and in relation to coastal marten. And 4D is a section of the Endangered Species Act that allows us to promulgate a rule when we list a threatened species where we can exempt certain management activities from incidental take prohibitions, as long as those actions are consistent with the recovery of the species, or better yet, promote the recovery of the species. And for example, in this case, this 4D rule that is coming out with this marten listing would be any actions that are consistent with existing scientific permits, for example, research permits, collecting animals, trapping them, putting equipment on them, putting radio tracking equipment, whatever might be done for marten. Actions that are related with fuels management are exempt from take prohibitions. Actions that are already authorized under the California Endangered Species Act, where marten might be listed, and they're in plans or agreements that are authorized. Actions that are already under a plan or a strategy with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So for example, if you had an HCP or a CCAA or a memorandum of understanding. And lastly, actions that where folks are going in to clean up contaminated sites with where toxicants have been used to kill pests, for example, at illegal marijuana grow sites. So, but the bottom line here with this 4D rule is we don't want a listing to slow down, derail, or stop otherwise good and appropriate actions that need to go forward. And these actions are all consistent with the recovery of the species. So moving up the sort of size scale in the taxonomy list here, from marten up to fisher, its bigger cousin. We just published a final rule listing the Southern Sierra population of the Pacific fisher. So you can see on the map there, down in the Southern Sierra, down around Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks, we listed that as a distinct population segment, but we withdrew what we refer to as the Northern California, Southern Oregon population from listing consideration. primarily because the numbers were large enough, the population appears to be stable enough, and as I'll explain in a couple minutes, there's a fair amount of conservation activities underway up in the northern part of the range that greatly reduce the threats. Likewise, as I mentioned earlier, probably a legal challenge on this as well, but that's pretty much the world we live in, and we're used to just continue trying to do our best on conservation while the legal process works itself out. So I mentioned earlier CCAAs, and we developed in Oregon a template, what we call a template Fisher CCAA, and associated site plans, where it was kind of a generic CCAA that individual landowners could take and tailor to their properties. It was based on the CCA up in Washington State, as well as work that had been done down in California. And we right now have eight plans and permits in place with individual landowners and the state of Oregon. And landowners and companies can still enroll in this. Again, I mentioned, even though it's a candidate conservation agreement, a candidate is a species that's being considered for listing, and we've now decided not to list the Fisher. As I mentioned, we get litigation and judges ruling all the time, and this one has, over the last 20 years, the Fisher listing decision has bounced a bit back and forth. So I guess I would recommend, if folks are interested, they contact us on CCAA. And here's just a map showing the covered lands. I hope this shows up on your screens. The yellow properties are the private and state lands that are covered now under the CCAs that are currently enrolled. And the activities that are occurring on those lands include things like conducting research on Fisher on private and state land, leaving certain areas as denning sites, trees that are good for denning or for roosting or loafing sites for Fisher, various habitat features that are otherwise consistent with the land manager's goals. So I mentioned earlier how we're trying to do things a little bit differently than the early days of the spotted owl, where we pretty much just list the species and then hope landowners would be able to do things for the species. Here we're working much more proactively up front to try and keep species off the list first. And if we're not able to do that, for example, in the marten case, we can do actions that are consistent with the land managers, otherwise legitimate and important goals. So I'm going to switch back to northern spotted owl. Obviously, we could take hours talking about spotted owl issues, current and ongoing. But what I wanted to mention primarily is that we are about to wrap up a barred owl removal experiment that's been going on for the last 4 or 5 years. Many of you probably heard that in these areas that are mapped here, as well as down in Northern California, we've set up some treatment and control sites where we remove barred owls and see what spotted owls do. And in other, in the control areas, we're just monitoring barred owl populations and activities. Overall, the lead for the experiment has been USGS, working with many other partners. And overall, it's been quite a successful experiment. About 3,200 barred owls have been removed across the 3-state range during this time period. And we've learned a lot about spotted owls' response, as well as barred owl behavior and intense suppression of spotted owls in those areas. And what this has led to is a consideration development of a barred owl management strategy across the range of the spotted owl. We don't have a plan yet. We have created several teams, scoping and steering teams that will develop options for a management strategy that then will be put forward in the form of an EIS with several alternatives for consideration. And the bottom line, though, is that the barred owl is affecting not just northern spotted owls pretty significantly, but other species as well. And it is something that needs to be dealt with for all forest land managers. I will say we've had great collaboration from private, state, and federal folks on this project as well. Some other spotted owl news and updating that is important to do is share with you is back in 2012, we had a petition to uplist the spotted owl from threatened to endangered. We've considered that petition. We've sent our recommendation back to Washington, D.C., and the final decision is sitting with the Department of Interior right now for whether or not to respond to that petition with an uplisting or to keep the status as threatened. We, back in 2016, worked closely with BLM to approve and update their resource management plans, in essence amending the Northwest Forest Plan. There's been lawsuits about that from both the industry and environmental side, but the bottom line is, from our perspective, that plan is an improvement on the Northwest Forest Plan and updating in the Northwest Forest Plan, and provides good conservation for species while providing some pretty reliable timber outputs. And prior to the wildfires and COVID hitting this year, BLM both hit their timber targets, and we had increased reserves for spotted owls and other species as a consequence of that plan. The Forest Service right now is initiating a similar effort for their LRMPs that will also forest by forest update the Northwest Forest Plan in the range of the spotted owl. Some of you might have heard that we have a relatively small critical habitat revision occurring right now. It should be final by the end of this calendar year in December. We're proposing a reduction of about 200,000 acres of BLM and some tribal land in Oregon only. And that was also a consequence of a lawsuit that the government settled with timber industry on. Those 200,000 acres are located in the timber harvest areas of the BLM RMPs. So in that sense, they've already been classified for timber harvest during the life of that plan. So from a critical habitat perspective, it really doesn't have much of an impact on the other 9.5 million acres of spotted owl critical habitat across the 3 states. So we don't view that as too much of a conservation issue, but it does remove some bureaucratic and regulatory oversight for BLM on those projects. Lastly, I'll mention that we're doing some habitat conservation plans with partners, one on the Elliott State Forest, and many folks are familiar with what's going on the Elliott, and the state's, Oregon State University's current proposal to turn that into a research forest, which would still require a HCP with the Fish and Wildlife Service and with NOAA on salmon. And likewise, we're in the middle of conducting a HCP process on the rest of the state's Western Oregon forests, the Tillamook, the Clatsop, and the Santiam. And some of you might have been participating in yesterday's Board of Forestry meeting on that HCP, where they voted to proceed to the next stage, which is to develop EIS and do the NEPA work on that HCP. And then we also have some private lands HCPs going as well. Of course, the fires have definitely injected some uncertainty into the process, but at least as of this presentation, we're proceeding with all of these projects. A few other upcoming actions that affect forest issues are a proposed delisting of the gray wolf in the lower 48 states. As many of you know, wolves have been expanding in Oregon. There's been a fair amount of activity right now in Southern Oregon, down in the Klamath Basin, and in Northern California. We have wolves right now actually moving back and forth across state lines. If this decision goes final, pretty much any day now, it's been sitting also in the Department of Interior for final approval. There will likely be some pretty swift legal action on this, given the high profile nature of the wolf status. But nevertheless, we've been consulting with the Forest Service and with BLM and with tribes and with the states on wolves in forest environments. We're also evaluating the lynx, Canada lynx status, and we did a 5-year review of that species and recommend that delisting is warranted for the Canada lynx. Now I'm going to talk about a couple other species that are kind of on deck here. And some of them are a little different than what we're used to. And certainly not as, I won't call them, megafauna, although in my opinion, they're quite charismatic. They're charismatic microfauna, and that includes several amphibians and some invertebrates for consideration of listing. And we're doing what are called 12-month findings, and that's a decision of whether to list or not list the species. And here across the next 3 or 4 fiscal years, we'll be considering several of these species. The amphibians in Oregon that we've been petitioned to list include the Columbia torrent salamander, the Cascade torrent salamander, the foothill yellow-legged frog, and the Cascade frog. Some of you might be familiar with the Oregon spotted frog, which occurs up in the Cascade Range, mostly on the west side right now, up in the Deschutes Basin, or I'm sorry, on the east side, up in the Deschutes Basin, and then up into Washington State, that we did list and designate critical habitat for a few years ago. And this is just the respective ranges of those critters. So you can see kind of the areas that they affect in the state of Oregon, which overlaps, a lot with forested lands. Another species that we receive petitions on fairly regularly and thus have been generating a fair amount of information on is the western pond turtle. This species does overlap with forest environments, obviously, but it's mostly in the wetlands and the valleys. And its main issues are, habitat quality and invasive species, invasive predators like largemouth bass, bullfrogs, things like that. So we'll be reconsidering the status of western pond turtle in Oregon. And then lastly, these invertebrates include several snails and a jumping slug. And I know these maps are a little small for folks to see, but the Dale's sideband snail occurs up near the Dalles in Oregon, up above in the Columbia Gorge, and then into the hills on the backside of Mount Hood. The Puget Oregonian snail is up in the Puget area, but gets down into Oregon. The jumping slug, which I've never seen, and of course my first question was, how high does it jump? And I guess it's not a real jump, but more of a contraction and a predator escape maneuver. It contracts its body and moves some distance, which I guess is a big deal for a slug. And the Columbian Oregonian snail, which occurs along the Columbia River. Now, these are, again, 12-year reviews. We'll be evaluating status, collecting information, and I'll use this as a early request for if folks have an interest in these species or know about these species on their property or around areas where they've worked or seen, please feel free to share it with our folks. And so that's really the, just a very quick update on a variety of species issues going on right now. I didn't get into, too many specifics on any of them, which of course would take up more time than Fran would give me. But I do want to say that, again, that we're compared to, I'm going to say when I first started almost 30 years ago in forest issues in the Northwest, we're doing a much more collaborative approach early on, trying to keep species off the list, or if they are listed, taking proactive steps using, for example, these tools like a 4D rule or a CCAA or an HCP that can better integrate forest management into, including harvest, into species conservation efforts. And of course, most recently, this includes as well, or I should say importantly, given the recent wildfires, fuels management, proactive fuels management, as well as post-fire salvage harvest. So with that, Fran, I think I can end it. And if you wanted to do questions now or wait till the panel concludes, I'm happy to stick around for both. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. We do have a few questions that I'm hoping you can answer for us now. And one of them, talks about just like you were saying, the endangered species. We're trying to keep the species off that list. And then, if they make it to the list, try and recover them. Can you speak to a little bit about the percentage of listed species that have recovered in Oregon?
Yeah, I could. Actually, I was trying to work my computer while you were asking the question. Yeah, so actually Oregon has been a leader in taking species off the endangered species list and recovering species. Some folks might have heard about the Oregon chub, which was the first fish delisted for recovery in the history of the Endangered Species Act. And that's a species that only occurs in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley. And we've also just delisted the Borax Lake chub, which is out in the Alvord Desert, eastern Oregon. The Foskett speckled dace. Let's see, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, several other species. Columbian white-tailed deer down in Douglas County. And folks might be familiar with that. We took that off the endangered species list and are looking to downlist the Columbia River population of that white-tailed deer. That's just in Oregon. but more broadly, we've got probably about 52 species now have been recovered and taken off the list nationwide. I should say internationally, because about 8 or 9 of those are international species in Pacific Island and a few things like Western Australian kangaroo and some of those international species that were put on the list very early on. But overall, while the pace for delisting was relatively slow in the early years of the Endangered Species Act, it's picked up a lot. And one thing I'll add, and I'm in the middle of actually writing a paper on this, is that one of the concerns about delisting species that people have is it might lead to folks not continuing to conserve them. But of those 52, pretty much all of them have been, are doing well, are stable or increasing. And that includes like species like Kirtland's warbler that some people might know in the upper Midwest. That's a forest fire dependent species, for example. As long as you provide the management for those species, they will do okay.
Well, that's great. Switching gears to the barred owl study that you discussed, we have a couple questions on that. And one is, folks are curious about how the barred owls are removed from the study area, and then repeating how many barred owls have been removed as a result of the study.
Yeah, so just to be clear, this is lethal removal. So barred owls are in those study areas, as well as on a few, outside the study areas, there are a few private lands in Northern California where they've been doing lethal removal of barred owls as part of a different kind of experiment. But they're called in and shot with a shotgun and collected. And those collected owls are then distributed to a variety of research institutions for genetic work, as well as other morphology and taxonomic and contaminant work for that matter. In fact, finding that some of the barred owls actually are pretty high levels of the toxicants that are used for, as in essence, rat poison throughout the Pacific Northwest, whether that's on illegal marijuana grow sites or it's in other sort of agricultural settings. It's unclear where all that's coming from.
Great. And then you mentioned the CCAAs and how important that program is, and the listing status of the fisher. And do you know if there's been any litigation regarding the listing status or the CCAAs?
Right now, there's no, as far as I know, we've not actually are responding directly to litigation for Fisher. I'm not sure if something's been filed or not on Fisher, but my guess is we probably will receive a challenge to the decision to not list the Fisher in Northern California and Southern Oregon. Again, I'll just reiterate that from our perspective, you know, the population over these last 20 years, when the first petitions came in to list the Fisher 20 years ago, we didn't know as much as we know now. The status of the species, you know, the biggest concern there was a greatly reduced range of the Fisher and some of these other issues that emerged, like the toxicant impacts. Many of the Fisher that we were collecting had, you know, high pesticide load on them. And right now, the population just appears to be relatively stable, and there's been reintroductions or moving Fisher around to expand their range. I guess the one biggest concern still, and this is where the CCAs come in importantly from a conservation perspective, is for some reason Fisher are not expanding their range back into their historic habitat. And this is area on federal land, for example, that's been set aside as late successional reserves or otherwise suitable for Fisher, but they're not recolonizing it. And I don't know, we don't know if that's just because Fisher are just a really, you know, not a hardcore colonizer, or it just has to happen over semi, you know, geologic time, or what. So can we help? And that's obviously what's been going on up in Washington State, where we've reintroduced Fisher into North Cascades, South Cascades, and Olympic National Park. And these are primarily British Columbia animals.
Great, thank you. We just had a question come in also about the Pacific Fisher habitat, and Katie might get to this in her presentation too, but what do you think about thinning operations in general? Are those compatible with maintaining habitat for Fisher?
You know, I'm not an expert in mustelids or, you know, these kind of issues. I'm a waterfowl guy by background, so that's why we've got a couple of Fisher folks on staff, and I know on the panel you're going to have a couple other people who are way more qualified than me. But I will say, in general, it's our perspective that they can be quite compatible. The radioed fishers and the cameras and everything are picking up fisher insights that are managed. Of course, Green Diamond Company makes, likes to, I'm going to say brag about fisher denning in one of their old slash piles. And so there's probably, some use of managed areas for, higher levels of food resources to the extent that brings a flush of some of their prey potentially when you do some of that activity. The main issue is leaving some of those legacy components for them, for cover, for roosting and loafing, or whatever's the mustelid term for sitting up in a tree sleeping, and as well as obviously denning and some cover for moving around and dispersal.
Great, Paul. Thank you so much. I think that's all we've got time for. So I appreciate you taking the time to answer those questions.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
So our next two speakers, I'll invite you to turn your cameras on now and get ready. So Dave Bugni and Dave Stewart are presenting next. And so we're going to switch from this high level picture and get down into the woods. And so Dave Bugni, is a retired civil and structural engineer and has been involved with fish habitat restoration projects for over 20 years and is also a small family woodland owner. And then Dave Stewart is a fisheries biologist with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he's been doing that for over 20 years. So I'll let them take it away.
All right. Do you hear me okay? Because I'm having trouble getting my video going here.
I can hear you.
Okay, it looks like it says you cannot host. Oh, here we go. Got it. All right.
There you are.
All right, here we are. So it looks like we're good to go. Yeah, let me share the screen here.
Perfect.
And all right, how does that look?
It looks good. Just remember to switch that display setting so that we see. Yep.
There we go.
Perfect.
All right. All right. Great. Yeah, I just want to thank Julie and everybody on the call today for, listening in on this. We're going to do a quick little run through, just a quick intro, and then we're going to jump into a video, which has about 6 minutes of myself going into some general habitat restoration. And then we'll have Dave talk more about a specific project. So as you said, I'm with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I work with private landowners, private and public landowners to do in-stream restoration work. And Dave is a great landowner who we've been working with for a number of years now. And I just want to say before we get into this video that the great thing is that, we talk a lot about salmon and steelhead and fish, but, the large wood projects that we're talking about here really focus and benefit a lot of species. So it's not just fish. We don't talk about that here that much because we don't have a lot of time, but just want to give a heads up there. And Dave, did you have anything else you want to throw in there before we get going?
Nope, just go right on ahead.
All right. All right. So, and if we have any time at the end, we can answer questions. We kind of zip through this. Like I said, I do more of a general example of in-stream habitat restoration, then Dave gets into a more specific project. So, yeah, let's jump into this. And if there's anything, questions, you can just add to Q&A. We'll answer them at the end. I want to start off talking about the philosophy of why we're doing large wood. And, we can see behind me, we have a couple of large wood structures that are set on top of bedrock. And that's the amazing thing about a lot of these streams. We can start off, first of all, where we're at, how we got to this point. And we've had years and years of human influence, right? We've had road building, we've had logging, we've had all these things that have, essentially, we've removed trees out of the channel. And because of that, the stream is now functioning not properly like it used to function. So what we're doing is pretty simple. I like to call it, it's short term. This isn't the long-term fix. The long-term fix is really these trees falling down naturally into the channel, right? Growing these trees big enough that they're going to stay in. But what we've done here is added large woody debris. And this is a big, important type of large wood restoration that we continue to do because the number one thing that these streams are missing from a salmonid perspective is, two big things if you want to boil it down, is cover for juvenile fish, cover and habitat for juvenile fish, and spawning habitat for adult fish. You know, essentially these fish are migrating. A lot of these fish are migrating down from the ocean coming back, and they need clean gravel to spawn in. And in a nutshell, these logs on the adult piece, they actually dam the river up, so to speak, and they collect that gravel and fine sediment, and that provides the spawning gravel, which helps them grow. When those fish hatch out from those eggs, now you've got a small juvenile fish that's trying to survive in here, and it's, you know, it's trying to avoid getting eaten by predators and eating food from the wood. So it's just this natural process, and it's, you know, it's ecology is what we're trying to create, is the natural function of the channel, and that's what large wood does. I mean, it's very simple. You don't have to be a rocket scientist or a, you know, really an engineer to, you know, to do a good project. Really, you just need to be able to put wood in the creek as much as possible, and the outcome is what we see here. We see wood that's collecting new gravels and collecting new debris, and it's just creating habitats. I always like to say too, this is not a short-term fix. This wood is going to take potentially, you know, years, decades before we might see some, you know, but we're already seeing benefits right now from the project. We're seeing new cover that's being created, but you know, some of these projects takes longer. You know, you got to imagine, when's that next 96 flood event, or that big humongous giant? That's when the habitat really changes. That's when the stream comes up to, we're sitting right here in the floodplain. When this thing comes up and water's up here, you know, or wherever it is on this channel, I guess the floodplain's kind of in this range, that's when things start changing. Although we haven't had a major flood event yet, which brings in a lot of the new changes in the channel, we do see already that there's gravel being deposited, there's fines, there's steelhead spawning in behind these structures, which is, you know, that's one of our big goals. So when you add everything together, you know, I look at this as a big successful project. You know, obviously we have a good landowner that's involved, and that's a big part of it. But the success is that, you know, we're seeing fish utilizing, right? And that's the bottom line, is that we are seeing fish right now after a few years utilizing these habitats. So that's in my book. And I guess the other thing you could look at, that the logs are still here too, right? I mean, there are some projects where we've learned from in the past where, you know, people have put logs in and maybe they're too small, maybe they weren't put in right and they flushed out. But we've got to a point now with the science that we understand what it takes to keep a log in the stream. And like we did here, we put in logs that were good size, and we could have put, based on the rule, maybe smaller logs, but we went a little bit bigger because we wanted to make sure that these things hold over time. With ODFW, I work on a couple different, you know, ends of the restoration. Right now we're up in the forest. This is a natural environment. There aren't a lot of structures around us. There's this great bridge that that Dave built here for a viewing platform, but you know, this is compared to the work I was doing this week, where I was doing a fish salvage on Johnson Creek, a trib to Johnson Creek, Kelly Creek, right in the middle of Gresham, one of our cities down there. And I mean, talk about human influence. We were removing a dam, same sort of stuff we've done here, but totally different, totally different. And you know, we got this landowner who owns the property, but we have a lot of other restrictions. And part of the struggle is that you know, the habitat's not as natural here, so you have to lock things in. We can't just lay trees down naturally and let them move around a little bit and adjust. There, we're really pinning things in. And so it's a totally, so I love getting up to these sites where we can actually just drop trees naturally, wedge them in between the riparian area trees. And essentially, the simple way to put it is, you can imagine X's. That's all we're doing in this channel. We're putting a log down, we're putting an X on top of that, and then we're making another X on top of that. And when you counterbalance and provide that ballasting mixed with wedging it in between trees, even when you get a flood at this level, those trees are gonna, you know, they're buoyant, but because they're ballasted, they're gonna stay. And I actually like to see a little bit of movement in these things. I think, you know, when the thing is pinned to a tree and it's rigid, that's kind of what you don't want, because you want the thing to adjust. You know, these things have probably moved a little bit over time. So I think the collaboration is probably one of the most important things here. You know, we're in a great spot. We know fish are here. We're benefiting fish, but without those great partnerships, you're not going to have a project. And I like to put it down to, you know, working with some of the great landowners we have, that one of the most important things in any project is having a local sponsor, somebody that you know is going to be champion that project, right? Because I'm just a fish biologist. I'm all about putting wood in the creek, and that's what I get paid to do. But when you have somebody on the ground that is actually doing that work and taking it to the next level, and that's why, you know, this project has been such a good example, because I mean, you take me out of the picture, this is the cool thing, right? You take me out of the picture and this project still gets done. Everything we've done probably gets done because we had a great landowner doing the work. So I just say it's all about partnerships, and Port Blakely is another good example that, you know, we talk, you know, them up all the time and all these, you know, great companies, because there are some companies that aren't as easy to work with. And when you get those companies that are great to work with and you get these partnerships, it makes everything easy. And this project has been easy. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, but I think over the years, this has been just a lot of fun.
And I just want to stop there. Does everyone hear me still okay?
Yep.
Yeah, just wanted to just highlight that you know, basically my job is here to work with all the landowners out there. So if anybody's listening, and we have biologists around the state, that's what we're here for. So I think this is a great example of a good project that Dave's going to highlight here. But just remember, you know, even if you don't totally understand everything we're getting into, you know, I'm just a phone call away to answer questions. So yeah, let's ready to jump into this, Dave.
Yep. Go ahead.
All right, here we go.
Hi, my name's Dave Bugni, and I'm the volunteer project manager for the Cedar Creek Fish Habitat Restoration Project located near Estacado, Oregon. This fourth and final project phase, being conducted during the summer of 2020, completes a multi-phase project begun in 2014. I will briefly describe the activities taking place during this phase and a summary of past phases. Cedar Creek, a second-order stream, is a tributary of the North Fork of Eagle Creek, and it has historically been a producer of coho salmon and winter steelhead. About half of this project, it was within institutional and public land defined within this white border here, which is owned and administered by the Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District, the Bureau of Land Management, Portland General Electric, and Clackamas County's Eagle Fern Park. For scale, this white line here is about 3/4 of a mile. This phase 4, again encompassed within this yellow line, entails placing 95 large Douglas fir logs in 22 log structures within the creek. 19 of these logs are larger than the rest and also have their root wads intact, which will help to enhance the stability of the large wood structures during high stream flows and provide additional cover for aquatic life. The project is inaccessible for conventional ground equipment. Log placements will be done using a Vertol helicopter, which has a payload capacity of about 15,000 pounds. The logs will be placed in the creek to mimic how nature did it for millennia, which fish and other forms of aquatic life utilize for cover, resting, and rearing. This large wood also creates deep pools and complex flow regimes, and it allows gravels to accumulate, which the fish need to spawn. The project will begin near Cedar Creek's confluence with the North Fork Eagle Creek on Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District property and extends upstream about a mile into my family's most downstream parcel. Historic logging practices remove trees adjacent to streams, preventing natural recruitment of logs as trees died due to age or disease or fell into the creek on account of wind or mass soil movements. It's also highly likely that any logs present in this creek were removed in some fashion during the 1950s and 60s by crews dispatched for such a purpose, under the mistaken belief at the time that unobstructed creek is what was best for fish. Phase 1 of the work, completed in 2014, located about 0.7 miles upstream of this phase, entailed the construction of 8 large woody debris structures using 50 logs donated by our family, the reactivation of 2 side channels, and the placement of 35 large boulders. In 2016, Phase 2 of the project, or the most extensive phase, was undertaken and completed. This work, located just upstream of Phase 4, entailed the removal of 2 side-by-side 6-foot diameter steel culverts where Cedar Creek flows beneath Clawson Road, which was a 53-year historic barrier to fish passage, and replaced them with a new precast, pre-stressed concrete bridge, allowing fish to access an additional 5 miles of the creek. The 3 large wood structures, 50 boulders, and 50 tons of spawning gravels were also placed upstream of the new bridge at locations spread over a distance of about a half a mile. In August of 2017, Phase 3 of the overall project was completed. This work entailed the placement of 8 large wood structures, including logs also donated by our family, 100 boulders, and 50 tons of spawning gravels. This phase occurred about 1.2 miles upstream of the project phase, which is the current Phase 4. With Phase 4 about to be completed, a total of over 2 miles of Cedar Creek will be restored for fish, enhancing fish habitat for threatened and endangered coho salmon and winter steelhead, among other benefits.
I will narrate some of this activity. This is the log and helicopter landing site where logs were stored and the helicopter was maintained. While I was down in the canyon, My wife videoed the activities in this area. The helicopter is picking up 2 smaller logs for placement into the creek. Even while the helicopter is away, the landing is bustling with activity, including organizing the next series of logs for transport. The helicopter is bringing down 2 logs. Note the extreme wind speeds and pressures developed. It can be a dangerous area and one must always be observant. The logs are located by placing large blue and pink ribbons on the ground. Pink for the location of a root wad or where the water end of the log is to go, and blue for where the opposite end is to go. Note how logs are wedged or pinned between adjacent bankside trees where practicable. The helicopter is typically only about 220 feet above the ground. Two teams were used to direct the helicopter pilot's placement of the logs. One team began downstream and worked up. The other began upstream and worked down. Other than myself and Dave Stewart of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, team members were comprised of personnel from Biohabitats and Columbia Helicopters.
Why do all this? Why expend all the intellectual and physical effort? Salmon and steelhead are a keystone species in an ecosystem. The keystone is that trapezoidally shaped top stone in an arch. If you remove it, the arch will collapse. From dippers to black bears to the surrounding forest, they all depend upon these fish. When you have a watershed like this, virtually undeveloped and unpolluted, with an intact forest canopy to keep water temperatures cold, the only limiting factor that prevents fish from thriving is a lack of high-quality physical habitat. Give them a place to spawn and rear, and they'll take care of the rest. By focusing on these minimally disturbed watersheds provides the quickest chance to recovery of these fish, and based upon my observations of previous restorations, results in the greatest benefit for the least cost. In summary, this is the final product. 22 log structures like this, with an average spacing of about 250 feet, along a stream length of about 1 mile. Each engineered log jam is a little different than the others in size and layout, designed for the space in which it's in, including some place to enhance scouring of the bank to recruit future spawning gravel. We already observed the creation of pools for fish to utilize. Given the large size and long length of these logs, the number that are pinned to live trees, as you see here on the bank, or wedged between large boulders, and interlocked between themselves, such as again as you see here, combined with the modest flow of Cedar Creek, these havens for fish should last for many decades. Over time, trees that are currently growing in the adjacent area next to the creek will succumb to age, disease, landslides, or wind, and will naturally fall into the creek to replace what we have put here today. Thank you.
Wow, that was really cool. It almost felt like we were out there on your forest. We did have a few questions coming in, and I think one, especially with all that helicopter use, was really, what was the funding like for this project? Did this come out of your back pocket, David?
No, a lot of sweat equity came out of my back pocket, but the funding, it's actually an excellent question. The majority of the funding on these projects came from the Portland General Electric's Clackamas River Mitigation Fund that they have established. And so that began about 2016, and then in 2020 here. Prior to that, we got funding from the Oregon Wildlife Federation, funded some of the large woodwork, which was probably around 20-some thousand, whereas the PGE funding in total in 2016 and 2020 was around 400,000.
Wow, that's great. And this question, I'm not sure which one of you want to tackle it, but it's about hardwoods and conifers along the stream banks, and sometimes it can be difficult to convert to conifers, and whether or not you think that's a good idea and how that might affect the fish in the stream.
I can take a stab at that first, and then Dave can follow up. I think it depends. The answer depends on the situation. Some people are avid conversion block advocates, to take out hardwoods, but I think hardwoods serve a purpose, as long as they aren't pervasive everywhere. But large wood, conifers are stronger. They grow larger. It takes them longer, but there's benefits for that. But whereas the hardwoods, they grow faster, they'll fall into the creek thus more quickly, so you'll get recruitment, but they usually won't last as long. But then you also get different aquatic insects, invading the hardwoods versus the conifers after they die. So Dave, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's right on. I think just diversity is probably better than just having all conifers for sure. And yeah, but every site is different.
That's right. We don't want to do the same thing everywhere. Well, I sure appreciate that presentation. And we are out of time, so I'll invite Ashley to come on now with her camera. And yep, and then you two can go on, turn your cameras off at this time. So our next speaker, we're going to stay on the topics of water, and Dr. Ashley Coble is a forest watershed scientist. She's with NCASI out of Corvallis. And I see your video's on. Ashley, do you want to take over?
Yes. Sorry, it's taking a minute to load. So I'm actually going to start off this presentation with the field component from the original field tour that was planned back in the spring. So the first portion will be a video, and then I'll give a research presentation on a different topic.
My name is Ashley Coble, and I'm a forest watershed scientist with NCASI. And I'm here today to talk about a new study that we have initiated last year. And this is a study done in collaboration with Dana Warren at Oregon State University, and also with a variety of private landowners that are participating in the study as well. So this study is all about assessing the effects of alternative riparian management practices on the aquatic food web and also on water quality. And so to do that, we are doing a wide-scale replication across Oregon and Washington. So we're going to have 6 replicate blocks in Oregon going in place last summer and this summer, and then an additional 3 replicates going in place in Washington next summer. And so the goal of this is to have 5 streams in each of those replicate blocks, and then those 5 streams, each stream will receive a different treatment, and those treatments represent a gradient of light availability on the stream channel. And so the reason for this is that closed canopies can often create really dark conditions relative to what typically occurs under old growth riparian zones. And so in old growth zones, you can often have gaps that occur naturally where there are pockets of greater light availability. And so those can actually be biogeochemical hotspots within the stream itself. And so part of the goal of our study is to evaluate some of these alternative types of riparian buffer configurations and how that may affect the stream food web. Here I'm standing in front of a corridor which created a gap during most recent harvest that occurred. So this is an example of how a gap can occur within a riparian buffer under current practices, although typically gaps are not asserted. So what we're going to do with our treatments is we're going to have a mid-range light availability treatment, and that mid-range treatment is essentially our current practice. So in Oregon, on a small fish-bearing stream, current practice is a 50-foot buffer, and then you can harvest within that 50-foot buffer to meet the basal area requirement. So it's a 20-foot no-touch, and then you can have management in the remainder of the 50-foot buffer. To get a darker condition from that, we're also going to have a 50-foot no-touch treatment. So this even even if you met the basal area requirements, you would not harvest within there. And then our darkest treatment is going to be simply an uncut unit, and that's just a unit of similar stand age class to all the other streams within our replicate block. On the other side of our middle ground, we'll be increasing light availability, and so that's where we're going to have a variable retention buffer. And so in that case, we're going to have places where we cut into the riparian zone a fair amount, so coming within 10 feet of the stream in some places, but in other places where we can identify maybe more ecologically beneficial, so those may be places with groundwater discharge coming in or unstable slopes, those would receive a much wider buffer. And so that could be double the buffer up to 100 feet. And so the idea is that we'd have the same overall amount of buffer, but a different configuration occurring. And then our greatest light condition is going to be a gap treatment. And so this is where we're going to have two large gaps that occur within our 300-meter reach. And so that will be going directly across the stream channel. And any trees that are cut within the riparian zone will remain in the riparian zone. They will not be taken out, but they will also not be placed in the stream. So we're going to try to manipulate light and not also manipulate wood availability on the stream channel. So our focus certainly is on the stream food web, but we're also measuring a variety of physical characteristics, including discharge, stream wetted widths and depths, substrate size classes, and also chemistry in terms of nutrient samples, nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and also just basic other water quality parameters as well. And so we are currently in the second year of our study. We have 2 years of pre-treatment data that are being collected, and then we'll have 2 years of post-treatment data. So between this fall and next spring, our first set of sites will undergo their first harvest treatments. My name is Ashley.
Okay, so smooth transition. Now I'm going to talk about a research project, and this is titled Evaluating the Effects of Forest Stand Age Distribution on Aquatic Ecosystems. So the reason this is important is that we know that sustainable forest management has a key objective, which is to protect water quality, but also to protect aquatic biota. And the biota we're interested in protecting, of course, is biodiversity, but is also native species. And here in Oregon, we can have native species that are listed species, like the coastal coho salmon, but we can also have other native species that are also present in many of our forested streams. And their presence, of course, can determine the amount of protection that a stream receives, because it'll define what the riparian buffer requirements are. So we know that fish-bearing streams require riparian buffers, whereas non-fish-bearing streams may receive less protection. And then we also know that streams with salmon, steelhead, or bull trout do also receive wider riparian buffers than other fish-bearing streams. And across the Pacific Northwest, there are also large landscape level changes occurring. And these are often developed from policy decisions. And so one of those is the Northwest Forest Plan, which went into place in 1994. And since then, we've seen a divergence in mean watershed stand age from federal lands relative to public lands. And so here on the picture on the left, you can see just an image of sort of a more mature forest from a federal forest land. And then on the right, you can see plantation forest on private land as well. And so we can also look at this in terms of data. So this is a figure from Steele et al. 2017. Here they're showing you the stand age classes across federal lands and private lands in Oregon. So on federal lands, the oldest stand age class, which is your darkest shading up here, is the greater than 120-year-old stands. And so 30% of all federal lands do have that oldest age class represented in Oregon. On private lands, that represents less than 5% of total land in Oregon. So we know that there are these large-scale changes happening, but what are the consequences of that on our aquatic ecosystems? And some of this has been explored previously. So this figure is a figure from Coble et al. 2003, where they looked at how macroinvertebrate communities changed with riparian stand age. So this isn't necessarily the entire watershed stand age, but this is the age of the riparian buffer adjacent to these stream reaches. And what they found is that macroinvertebrate density declined as riparian stand age increased. But they do note that, of course, that there's a lot of variability in the younger stand age classes in terms of total macroinvertebrate density. And then they hypothesized that the rationale for this is related to your basal resources. And basal resources, of course, can be things like nutrient availability, but can also be your energy availability, so carbon sources. And in terms of carbon sources, we know that our Pacific Northwest streams are light limited, and light limitation can then also provide low primary productivity. And so primary productivity in the stream would include all autochthonous organic matter, so that's organic matter that that grows within the stream channel itself. And so you need light availability in order to photosynthesize. But they also had a hypothesis related to allochthonous organic matter. And so this is your carbon, this is your organic matter that's coming from the terrestrial environment into the stream. So it's not produced in the stream, it's produced elsewhere and then brought into the stream. And so they hypothesized that those allochthonous organic matter inputs may also be higher in the youngest sites because there can be an increase in slash following harvest. So there's a lot of literature that was tied together and pulled together in Warren et al. 2016, and they created a series of hypotheses about how aquatic systems may respond to forest succession. And so this is moving from stand initiation here at the very far left end of your x-axis, stand initiation moving into canopy closure where we see stem exclusion occurring and very dark conditions on the stream channel. And then eventually, as you move into mature and old growth conditions, you can have individual tree mortality due to a wide number of factors, which can create canopy gaps, which can enhance light availability on the stream channel. So we can see this orange-yellow line is showing us our hypothesized relationship of how light is going to change on the stream channel throughout forest succession. So we have very high light availability early on, going into very dense, dark conditions in the mid-successional stages, and eventually slightly elevated light conditions as well. Because light is an important driver for primary production, that's our autochthonous carbon, so these are our primary producers, which is very much dependent on light availability. So we expect to see a very similar pattern in terms of our autochthonous carbon, and that's going to translate through the stream food web. So we can use these predicted responses at the bottom of our stream food web to then hypothesize about what's going to happen as we move up into the food web. So here we're looking at another hypothesized relationship. This is allochthonous carbon. So again, this is the carbon coming from the terrestrial environment into the stream channel. And this is based off some of the ideas in Coble et al. 2003, where they're predicting that there's increased slash that may occur immediately after a forest harvest. And then eventually that would decline and then be elevated again as you move into more old growth conditions, and there may be more organic matter available to enter the stream channel. So those are some of the ideas behind our study plan and our study initiation. For this study, we did randomly select 24 watersheds in the coastal ecoregion in Oregon. So we've limited this to the central portion of the coastal ecoregion. Our 24 watersheds were, half of those were selected were predominantly public and half were predominantly private. And so we essentially used ownership to develop a stand age gradient. So we're using ownership as a proxy for stand age. And we used the USGS HUC 12 designation for our initial random selection of watersheds. And then within each of those watersheds, we've then moved our site selection to stream orders ranging from 3rd to 5th order streams. And the reason for that is because we could not sample anything larger than that just due to logistical constraints. So our first question is whether or not light availability is following this anticipated pattern. So up here in the far right corner, I've sort of included our hypothesized relationship of light. And then you can see our actual data across these 24 sites. This is presented as photosynthetic active radiation. And we're not seeing any statistically significant response of light availability with mean watershed stand age. So if we had observed a response with light, then we might also expect stream temperature to follow a similar trend. Here, again, we don't have significant relationships with temperature. The figure on the left is showing you our 7-day moving average mean, and then the figure on the right is showing you the maximum. So you can see that the maximum point on the y-axis is much greater when we look at the 7-day max versus the 7-day mean. We're seeing very similar trends, however, across the sites in both cases. And we do see that the elevated temperature both at the youngest end of the stand age gradient and also at the oldest end, but we're not seeing that mean watershed stand age is a useful predictor of upstream temperature. So we expected light to then transfer up to our periphyton biomass. So we explored periphyton biomass across all of our 24 sites. And we used 2 measurements to do this, chlorophyll A, which would get at our primary producer component. And here we did see a significant relationship with chlorophyll A increasing with mean watershed stand age. This is a very slight increase overall. But it does explain 27% of the variability in our chlorophyll A response. We also measured ash-free dry mass, which is a measure of both living and detrital components of our periphyton biomass. So this would also include not only primary producers, but also bacterial components as well. And we don't see a significant relationship with that measurement either. So we also explored a variety of nutrients. So we looked at inorganic nitrogen, inorganic phosphorus, and dissolved organic carbon, and none of those did show relationships with stand age. So dissolved organic carbon quantity did not vary, but here what I'm showing you is that carbon quality does vary with watershed stand age. So the metric here on the y-axis is SUVA 254, that's the spectral UV absorbance at 254 nanometers. And that is can be used as a proxy for carbon aromaticity. So at the upper end of our SUVA, so a higher SUVA value indicates greater carbon aromaticity, and that's typically associated with more allochthonous sources, so terrestrial sources of carbon that are coming into the stream. The lower end of our SUVA value means less aromatic carbon, so that can indicate a microbial source, meaning it's been more processed, or also it can indicate a toxinous production, so that's carbon produced within the stream channel itself. So this does follow, I suppose, our allochthonous carbon hypothesis, with more allochthonous carbon occurring both at the youngest mean watershed stand ages, but also increasing as well at the older average watershed stand ages. So moving up the stream food web, then we explored macroinvertebrate community dynamics, and we've explored a number of indices, and I'm just going to show you a small portion of this data. So we looked at macroinvertebrate taxa richness, and we don't see a significant trend. It does sort of follow a U-shaped pattern, but we had a p-value of 0.07 indicating this is a non-significant relationship. We also looked at macroinvertebrate density, and we don't see significance for macroinvertebrate density either. We looked at a variety of diversity indices, including the Shannon diversity, which is shown here. There is not a significant relationship with diversity and mean watershed stand age here. So in general, we're not seeing the stand age being a useful predictor of macroinvertebrate taxa. What we are finding is that macroinvertebrates and carbon are linked. So here we're looking at intolerant taxa and also sensitive taxa in their response to dissolved organic matter stoichiometry. So the predictor here is dissolved organic carbon relative to dissolved organic nitrogen. And so components of dissolved organic matter do include both your organic carbon as well as your organic nitrogen pool. So these are all components of DOM, and SUVA value also indicates a little bit about the quality of that DOM. And so we're seeing very interesting relationships in terms of dissolved organic matter stoichiometry being a useful predictor of these intolerant taxa as well as these sensitive taxa. And so as that stoichiometric ratio increases, then we're seeing an increase in those sensitive taxa across our 24 watersheds. So overall, this is still very much an ongoing study. We've just wrapped up our 2020 field collection season, and we're very eager to work up that data and to be able to present additional fish responses and amphibian responses, as well as environmental DNA. But our preliminary conclusions thus far are that carbon quality, but not quantity, does vary with watershed stand age. We explored light, periphyton biomass, and macroinvertebrate communities, but those did not follow those expected responses with watershed stand age. Overall, our data do suggest that macroinvertebrates of carbon are linked, and that sensitive taxa in general did increase with dissolved organic matter stoichiometry. So we have a lot of collaborators on this project, as well as a variety of assistants that have helped out with collection of the data over the past couple of years, and a variety of landowners, of course, that are participating in the study and helping to make this a reality. And so at this point, I will take questions.
Yep, and we do have a little bit of time, so I can help you with that, Ashley. So that's so much information that you presented, and I think we had a lot of interest in it. And are there any write-ups that you have that you can share that we could send out, like a one-pager? I don't think any of your work that you've talked about today is published yet. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So there was a handout for the field tour portion that was meant to be shared, I guess, originally. So that's available. I don't have this summarized yet. We're still very much in the process of working this up, and hope to have more information soon.
Great. I'll follow up with you and we'll get that one pager out to all the participants today. And then I've got a really tough question for you. In your opinion, how effectively does the current Oregon Forest Practices Act protect aquatic quality and aquatic habitat and promote fish and other aquatic populations?
Yeah, so that's a very important question, certainly. I mean, yeah, so a lot of what we know about current regulations is all based on the recent paired watershed studies that have been completed here in Oregon. We're fortunate to have 3 that are all relatively recently completed. And I think your opinion on how well they're protecting aquatic biota depends on which metric we're interested in, right? So the fish response was generally no effect or potentially increase in biomass. From the ALSI watershed study, the other 2 did not report fish responses with adjacent harvesting. The harvesting was further upstream. You know, some of them show no responsive sediment. Some of them show that there is a sediment response. That seems to be very much tied with geology and underlying substrate. One of the bigger questions right now, of course, are the low flow dynamics, which is a very complicated issue. And there's some questions related to how stand age and in particular how riparian buffers may influence summer low flow dynamics, particularly at longer timescales. So that's been a hot topic. But I think there's still a lot to learn, and things have been improving, certainly, but there's still some more work to be done, and so we're hoping to better understand all of that.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so that brings us to the next part in our agenda, and I'll just remind all the panelists and participants that we're going to take just a little break right now, but that all our panelists will be back after the next 3 talks, so that any questions that you might have had for Ashley or Dave Stewart and Dave Bugni, you can ask again in the chat window, and we'll get to them at the end of the next session. So you have a few minutes. You know, if we were in person, we would all be getting up and saying hello in the break room, you know, out getting a donut or whatever. So I can't get you a donut, but I can allow you a few minutes to stretch, fill your water bottle, maybe make some popcorn, and then come back for the second half. So you get about 5 minutes now. I'll ask you all to be back by, let's see, what time is it now? It's 1:22. So if you're back by like 1:27, I think Julie's got a little raffle planned for us at that time too. And so we'll just, I'm gonna leave, I'll stay here. So if anyone has any questions, you can ask those for me now through the chat box, but we'll see you in just a few minutes.
Hi, Fran, it's going great. I'm excited today to also announce that we're going to have some fun along the way with SAF. And so one of the things we wanted to do is just make a couple quick announcements. One, some people ask about the SAF Continuing Education Protocol, and just to let you know, it is in the program. It's also on the website. If you go to the website, Mixed Years has there the form you're going to fill out. And at the end of the wildlife session, we're going to give you a code that makes sure that you've been watching along, and we'll give you that code that you'll fill in. We also have some bonus content, again, available on the website. And you can just go to both of those, and you have until October 14th to watch those. So we'll remind you a few times of this. It's on the program and in the website, these instructions and exactly how to get to that. We also know we're missing the Forester's Fund auction. I know that's always the fun thing to go around, bid on things, outbid your colleagues, and also do that raffle. And so we just encourage you, if you're still feeling generous, to do that. You can donate things to the national convention that's coming up in October, the end of October. You can also donate to the Forester's Fund that way, or you can send them auction items to be bid on. We're not going to take anything here for the local one. We're just going to help support the national one. But we thought we'd have a fun raffle, and being the way that foresters are great at Excel spreadsheets, we came up with, there's an Excel spreadsheet that you put in all the names and you hit F9 and it magically pops up with a raffle winner. So you're not playing for too much today. Sorry, not the big Wheel of Fortune money, but some SAF cool swag that you would have gotten if you came. So if your name is called, we are going to mail that to you, and you're going to get a mug and or a SAF bag. So just kind of depends on whatever gets put in the mail. But our very first winner that came up is Alicia Christensen with OSU. So Alicia, you are going to get our first raffle winner. So you have to stay tuned and stay tuned in for raffle winnings throughout. We're going to pop up whenever we have a few minutes and help you guys end up with some cool SAF gear. So Alicia is our first winner. Perfect. Thanks, Fran. Thanks for helping moderate today, and I'm excited to hear more from the wildlife team.
All right, welcome back to part 2. And I see that Alicia already responded in the chat window, so she's tuned in and is excited to get her swag, so that's fun. Cool. Okay, so I see Jake's got his video on. Our next speaker is Dr. Jake Verschuyl. He is also with NCASI. I introduce Jake all the time, so I invite you to read his bio, but I would say about Jake that I really appreciate is how much he loves his family and how much of an adventurer he is. So Jake, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Fran. And hopefully you all are seeing my presentation at this point. Great. So when I was asked to give this talk on wildlife use of structural retention patches, we were planning to have this discussion as part of a field tour coordinated by Oregon SAF. And you've heard that already from a couple of different speakers. And so in light of that, I want to invite you to take a short journey with me for a minute and picture our discussion today being held on a beautiful spring day in the Oregon Cascades. And it's likely we would be standing on a landing somewhere and we'd be staring out at a retention patch. And because I'm a wildlife biologist, we'll add that birds will be singing and flowers will be in bloom. And it'll be a perfect setting for our discussion of operational forestry and wildlife. And as we look up into that retention patch in the 4-year-old stand of thriving Douglas fir, we might be thinking about a number of different things. The operational foresters might be thinking about operational constraints as we look at this patch and potential hazards. We might be thinking about lost timber value as we look at, these are some pretty beautiful mature trees here, and where those were left behind and how that might influence the total value left standing. Or potentially even reforestation challenges and seedling survival and potentially herbicide applications and how that may become more challenging around some of our retention patches. But we would probably also likely acknowledge that structural retention has some value for wildlife. And so that might be the center or the beginning of our discussion. And it certainly resonates with a lot of people around our region. And it's led to landscapes that may even look something like this. And this is just across the Columbia River on Washington Department of Natural Resources land in Clark County, Washington. And you're obviously seeing a landscape here with some really wide riparian buffers, but also quite a bit of upslope scattered retention patches all across the landscape here, with the general idea that these retention patches provide some landscape scale heterogeneity that would generally be favorable for wildlife. But exactly how, that isn't necessarily answered. So what do we know about wildlife use of structural retention? We do know that the type, the amount of the retention, the distribution, all influence wildlife use. Certainly the age of the regenerating stand, retention at the time of harvest versus 20 years down the road, what the adjacent stands are, as well as the landscape context, like you saw in that previous image. The abiotic factors, was this retention left on top of a ridge somewhere, or was it in a valley bottom? And then the taxon of interest, we don't want to overlook that. Which wildlife species are we talking about? Are we talking about mobile bird species that can fly from stand to stand, or the less mobile species like the Oregon slender salamander or certain species of beetle or small mammals? So retention has been the focus of prior research. And we've seen some interesting examples. And one of them is the demonstration of ecosystem management options study conducted by on national forest lands. And this particular aerial image is in the Umpqua National Forest in the Oregon Cascades. And so you can see here some retention patches, some patch harvesting. You can also see some thinning that occurred in another area. So all of this was part of an experimental study looking at the value and placement of structural retention. And then you can see here another image of Western Forest Products, another famous variable retention study primarily conducted by UBC faculty. And this is in Powell River, British Columbia here. And so with most of these studies, you can see here variation in the total amount of retention. 5% retention left in scattered trees versus 10%, 30%, or an unharvested control. And these studies have focused not just on varying the total amount of retention, but also other things, intangibles like aesthetics. How do you harvest without really making it look like you harvested at all? Or societal acceptance of the different types of forestry going on. And so in general, some of those findings have limited application for production for us. So we're at this point where we've agreed on structural retention having value for wildlife, but how can we maximize wildlife use of what is left behind in the harvest unit? And so that got us started on exploring an experimental study, looking at evaluating structural retention practices with sort of a tagline of what do you get for what you leave behind? And in doing this, we partnered with collaborators at Michigan State University, Dr. Gary Roloff and his PhD student, Sean Soltaire, and also AJ Kroll, a research wildlife biologist with Weyerhaeuser. And before I move on, I want to acknowledge that this study wouldn't have been possible without this large group of landowners on whose land these study sites occurred. And we'll talk a little bit more about those treatments and sites here in just a moment. So there's also been a suite of applied research studies that really did function in an applied working forest landscape. And we've learned a few things from those studies, one of which is small patches generally have more value than individual trees when left behind. And so these small patches of kind of a minimum threshold size of 10 to 15 trees were able to maximize bird species richness and abundance in terms of use of the structural retention. We also learned that structure use depends on landscape context. If you leave structure in a landscape that has a lot of mature forest and potential legacy structure, that structure may get less use than if it is left in a landscape that's predominantly younger, even age forest stands. So legacy structures, we also learned, even in production forest landscapes, are abundant in Western Oregon, but are also in decline as we move through successive rotations. So what are the structures we're talking about? We're talking about living green trees, snags, and down wood. In this particular study, we're looking at the retention requirements within the state of Oregon, here highlighted at the bottom, as 2 snags or green trees left behind per acre of harvested area. Those snags or green trees are meant to be greater than 30 feet tall and greater than 11 inches DBH. And so in this operationally focused study, we set up 5 treatments that took that total retention required under Oregon State Forest Practices rules and moved it around the slope position and the aggregation of the retention to see how we could maximize wildlife value. So our first treatment was riparian associated patch. So a single patch associated with an existing riparian buffer that used up all of the trees that were required to be left behind per the Oregon State Forest Practices rules. Our second treatment is an upslope treatment, taking all of those same trees and moving them upslope away from any riparian buffer. A third treatment is split retention, taking the total number of trees and splitting them evenly, putting half of them down along the riparian buffer and half of them in an upslope position. A fourth treatment is roughly the same, splitting that total retention in half, but also taking half of each of those patches and creating snags with a mechanical harvester, removing the top portion of the tree from the site and leaving roughly a 25-foot tall created snag as a retention tree. And then finally, the dispersed retention. And so these, based on prior research, we used patches of 15 trees each, where half of those trees were created snags and the remaining half were green trees remaining standing. So you can see here on this map the geographic spread of our sites in southern Washington and Oregon. And you can see that we've split them into 10 distinct geographic blocks with 5 treatments randomly assigned per block. The harvest occurred between 2012 and 2015. We allowed standard regeneration practices, so generally herbicide was applied across the site before the seedlings were planted, and over 4,000 structures entered the study. So what do these treatments actually look like? These sites will probably look familiar to many of you just in terms of their operational landscapes here in Western Oregon. And we have a riparian treatment shown there in the upper left, an upslope treatment, which I showed you on the beginning slide, the split treatment, where only the riparian patch is shown here, the split treatment with created snags, and you can see those across the bottom of that patch there, showing up only roughly about 25 feet tall. And then finally, the dispersed treatment. And in this particular picture of a dispersed treatment, 4 of the 8 standing green trees have already blown down. So what we know about retention is that we're looking at the canopy, we're staring up at this retention patch, but what actually goes on, and so a lot of the wildlife value actually occurs in the understory. So as we considered that, we wanted to consider studying wildlife species that would respond to that understory and kind of ground level disturbance. And so instead of taking on birds, which is generally near and dear to my heart, and I've probably spoken with many of you before about some of our bird studies, we took on an investigation of small mammals and carabid beetles, looking at their abundance, diversity, richness, as well as functional diversity, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So our sampling included tomahawk and Sherman small mammal trapping in grids that occurred both in the patch and outside within the harvested area of the stand, as well as these simple pitfall traps for the carabid beetles. So removal sampling there for the carabid beetles. So as is the case with a lot of small mammal studies, and one of the reasons that I often end up studying birds is that you get a few species that really dominate your sample. And we expected that here, but as it turns out, deer mice, creeping voles, and Townsend's chipmunks made up relatively large portion of our total sample, 80% of the species captured. And that's actually okay because those 3 species have somewhat different life histories and can tell us a lot about how that stand is functioning. So we used this spatially explicit capture-recapture model. And basically all I want to tell you about that is that we incorporated the year of sampling as well as the treatment and the interaction term between year and treatment in the model. So for the deer mouse, a very common species, we found similar abundance in both the harvested areas and the retention patches. And we found the lowest total abundance in the upslope aggregated treatment, so where we put all of the trees in the upslope position. For the Townsend's chipmunk, we found the greatest abundance in the patches and the highest total abundance in the dispersed treatment, that treatment 5. And for the creeping vole, a very open habitat species, we found greater abundance in the harvested portion of the stands, but at the stand scale, the highest total abundance in the upslope aggregated treatment. Looking at small mammal species richness, the number of species of small mammal represented at stand scales and also within the retention and clear-cut portions of the stand, we found a small but consistent effect of treatment on small mammal species richness. with the lowest total species richness in that upslope aggregated treatment. And one other thing I want to point out here is that stands that were harvested, all of them, all 5 treatments, had more small mammal species than nearby sampled rotation age forest around 40 years of age. So functional diversity, I mentioned that we'd talk a little bit more about this. The functional traits are measurable aspects of a species that reflect kind of what it's doing and how it's interacting with other organisms and its environment. For carabid beetles, it's relatively easy to assess functional diversity by measuring the mandible length and width. And when I say relatively easy, you can imagine these are small samples and we're doing this by microscope. So here, increases in that length to width ratio of the mandible suggests greater levels of specialization. And so what we can see here, the dashed lines represent the patch species specialization, whereas the solid lines are the harvest unit species specialization. And we can see that for all treatments, the patches had more specialized species than did the harvested area, except for the dispersed treatment where those two were still relatively similar. And you can tell in that picture of the dispersed treatment, we certainly didn't have a closed canopy or really change the ground level conditions there. So one other way that we can assess that functional diversity is looking at how different the beetle communities are in the harvested area versus the retention patch itself. And so this is dissimilarity, but the general idea here is that for all of our treatments, the patches were not very similar in terms of species composition from the harvested portion of the stand. They actually offered different species in the patch, except for that dispersed treatment that I mentioned before, treatment number 5. And so there you can see that leaving your patches in that dispersed treatment does not provide the same boost to beetle community diversity as did the other treatments. So in summary, we found that more species of small mammal occurred in the harvested stands than in those rotation age forests, that upland aggregated retention had lower overall small mammal diversity. Retention patches brought greater beetle functional diversity than the harvested areas. So the patches really increased that functional diversity. And dispersed retention didn't really. It resulted in less beetle diversity at stand scales overall. As we talk about retention though, what many of you are familiar with is that many times when you leave retention standing, it's less than a year before that retention is actually in a horizontal position. And so one of the things we wanted to look at, and one of the reasons we classified our structures and quantified them at the beginning of the study, tree tagging over 4,000 structures, was to look at our % leave tree mortality by treatment as well. And you can see here that in general, we had between 10 and 50% mortality, with the highest level of blowdown occurring in the dispersed treatment, as you might expect, also the greatest amount of variation. So our surprises in this study, we were surprised to find that the upland aggregated retention generally had lower value for small mammals, both abundance and diversity. And we were also surprised that a forest-associated species, the Townsend's chipmunk, was more common in that dispersed retention treatment. But that forest-associated species also really keys into downwood. So it could be the fact that a lot of those trees had already blown over that brought those Townsend's chipmunks in. And then we were also surprised to see, and this is somewhat anecdotal, that we had bat use of downwood. In that previous photo that I showed you, when the bark begins flaking off those down trees, we were seeing bats using them as day roost sites. So still to be discovered, there's a lot still to be discovered, but how wildlife value changes as the regenerating stand grows. This all occurred in kind of the 3 to 5 years post-harvest range. The use of those created snags that we talked about as a function of patch placement. So that investigation hasn't been done yet. As well as a continued assessment of structure longevity. How long are these structures going to last by treatment? And then, as you might have noticed on that initial map of our study sites, some of these sites have now burned. And so it certainly will be interesting to look at the influence of fire across our different treatments as well. And so I look forward to continuing this discussion while we are all standing on a landing on a warm spring day sometime, hopefully in the near future. And with that, I think we've still got time for a couple of questions.
We do have a little bit of time, Jake. Thank you for that. I have a couple of questions for you. The first one is just about kind of the study setup, and if you know of any similar studies that might have looked at the connections to the riparian area, so structure retention in a lateral way that they would provide connectivity to the upland habitats from the riparian area?
Not directly. A couple of the different things that we are interested in looking into, as you're probably all aware, the state forest practices rules around retention differ between Oregon and Washington. We had some of these sites located in Washington, and our treatments play out a little bit differently there, with some of the type N streams there, the non-fish bearing streams receiving buffers over 50% of their length, or the perennial initiation points also receiving buffers that somewhat are functioning a little bit more like upslope buffers. And so there's quite a bit of interest, I think, in trying to tease apart, especially when we're seeing these kind of bump on a riparian buffer retention patches holding a fair amount of value for, let's say, species richness of small mammals. How different is that community than it would have been in just the buffer itself? And so I think that's still some questions to be answered there. But as far as linking for less mobile species, I'm not sure that we have that data yet.
Okay, and then along the same lines, how far upland were the upland retention sites from the riparian buffers?
Right, so we wanted to, in general, those upland retention sites almost exclusively so, because we needed to find sites with riparian buffers. So our upland retention sites almost exclusively occurred in stands that did not have a riparian buffer at all. So it was kind of a stratified random assignment of our treatments, because we were looking at some of these sites that didn't have buffers. They therefore couldn't fit into treatments 1, 2, or 4. And so we had to assign them to treatment 2 or 5. So in other words, a good long ways from a riparian buffer. And typically we wanted to make sure that they were at least 100 meters into the stand, away from the stand edge as well.
Awesome. We do have a couple more questions for you, but I'm going to save them till the full question and answer session so that we can give Katie her full 20 minutes, because I know she needs it.
Great.
Thanks, Jake.
Fran.
So our next speaker is Dr. Katie Moriarty, and she's going to dive deeper into some of those species that Dr. Henson was talking about earlier. Katie, it is all yours.
Thank you, Fran. I want to thank you and the other moderators for the opportunity to speak today. The goal of my talk is to showcase some of the exciting research that we're doing, some of the techniques and challenges for the species that are near and dear. I'm going to go through a lot of different studies, unlike the last talk, which focused on one results. But what I want everyone to take away are 2 themes. First, that collaboration and communication are going to be really important as we look towards these species and what to do in the future. And the second, I know it's a strange year, and there's a lot of challenges that you hear in these talks and elsewhere, but I really think that there's opportunity for creative and positive solutions. So to begin, I think as we look backwards through time.
Oh, Katie, can you start your slideshow?
Can I start what?
You start your slideshow. I'm still seeing that's not quite in presentation mode.
I did, but I will do it again.
Maybe it's me.
No.
Your full 20 minutes.
There are always fun technical difficulties with things like virtual conferences. How about now?
Yep, now I'm seeing the video. Here we go.
Great. So we have a rich history going backward in time in Oregon of forestry and land stewardship. And some of that land stewardship involves a balance of trying to understand production and needs of native wildlife species. One of the most familiar forest-dependent species that we all know are the northern spotted owl, certainly. And I'm going to talk not about the spotted owl, but 3 other forest-dependent species, maybe that you know a little bit less about, but hopefully you heard Paul Henson's talk earlier today. two underscores with these species that I really want to impart to this audience is one, our knowledge base to address management related questions are scant. We have foundational research, certainly there's research coming, but we don't have a lot of information to really assess trade-offs in the future of how to move forward. And secondly, these three species are all much harder to study than spotted owls prior to barred owls. So there's a lot of training and information and background and nuance, and each one of them is quite different to try to move forward. So hopefully those two themes come across. First, I'd like to focus on red tree voles. These rodents exist only in the canopy. They eat predominantly Douglas fir needles, and they do so in a really amazing way where they peel the resin ducts one at a time like a corn of cob, and then consume the Douglas fir needle itself. They're endemic, of course, to the Pacific Northwest. And one of the things that you might find interesting that a lot of our foundational knowledge comes from a logger in the 1960s and 70s. Doug Bake noticed these red rodents, red mice, running around when he cut down trees. And he just ran around and collected them. He collected almost 98 tree voles, worked with a mammologist, created a lot of observation. So a lot of our background information comes from this individual who was curious and also collaborative. Our techniques are a little bit less obtrusive than cutting down trees and trying to chase after these running little voles. They're still highly technical, a lot more modern, perhaps. And typically, the dogma has been that red tree voles are only in older forests. And they are in older forests, certainly. But one of our 2019 pilot data showed that we had recent vole sign and nests in a lot of the young forest stands 20 to 40 years of age. You could see one red tree vole nest in the center of the screen here. So with a lot of collaborators, we embarked on this study. And our primary objective is to quantify the relative abundance of red tree vole nests across stand ages and distance from old forests. And one of the things that we're really proud about is that this study encompasses much of coastal Oregon. Our strata is divided into 4 regions where we have stands that are in each of those age classes in these 4 regions. And our surveyed stand differs in the distance from old forest patches. So we have a kind of a design that seems very robust. The second portion of our study is trying to estimate nest status by tree voles and other mammals, and this requires us to climb to these particular stands. When we're looking at these stands, many of the nests are red tree voles, but there's a lot of species that use the canopy, including wood rats and northern flying squirrel or Humboldt flying squirrel, birds. And it's really challenging. So this nest here with the moss is very indicative of a squirrel nest. But as you look closer, there are holes with resin ducts, which is very characteristic of red tree voles. So it's impossible to identify tree vole nests from the ground. It requires climbing. And our third objective is to develop a foundation for evaluating stand structure and use over time. And this is really exciting because we are uniquely marking every tree that we survey and every nest with a unique identifying tag. We are also monitoring many of the nests, especially those with recent sign, with remote cameras similar to what people use to look for deer or anything that's motion activated. So overall, this study is really exciting. It's at a large spatial scale. We're only in our first year. We hope this will be a 3-year study, and it's very exciting. Our second species to discuss today are the Humboldt martens, coastal martens, also a subspecies of Pacific marten, if you've heard that name. You may think about these animals that are about the size of a gray squirrel in relation to some of their close cousins that you might be more familiar with. So if you think about fishers that I'll talk about in a moment, or ferrets or sea otters, all of these animals in the same family have very similar characteristics, but also different. For Pacific martens in general, which are all the martens west of the Rockies, you likely would envision high latitude or high elevation, snow-covered environments. But these particular martens are not the same. These martens live in the coastal region of Oregon and Northern California. This is a range map that may depict their prior range, and you might have realized that in Oregon, we only knew of 26 locations as of 2014, 14 of which were roadkill. And because this was highlighted as a potential issue by the Fish and Wildlife Service, teams that I led and a lot of collaborative partners surveyed much of forested Oregon, both for Humboldt martens and Pacific fishers, which I'll talk about later. And this work was accomplished with survey techniques such as remote cameras and detection dog teams. A lot of their endeavors involved a lot of crawling through very dense forests in the Oregon Coast Range, so it was an insurmountable amount of work, certainly. But we did find marten locations, so now all of these particular orange dots represent areas in which we know martens persist in the last few years. And NCASI was able to come and survey many of those areas for vegetation characteristics. We compared where Humboldt martens exist to northern spotted owls and their reserves, and we found that there is very little, if not no relationship. So Humboldt martens are in completely different areas than northern spotted owls, and the vegetation varies widely. One of the things that we were able to find is they are closely related to dense shrub cover. Now we're taking on an endeavor where we're looking at these GIS maps, these remotely sensed images that represent things like canopy cover, precipitation distance to coast, to make a predictive range map. And this is very challenging. And I think in part for 3 reasons. First, martens are quite small, but they are moving on a daily basis similar to that of a mountain lion. They are moving far more on a daily basis than a bobcat, and both of these 2 sprinters can certainly outrun a marten at short distance and could potentially consume them. In fact, the only creatures that martens are surpassed by in their movement are wild dogs and wolverines. This is really challenging. It's really challenging because they need a lot of food. So a marten and all of the members of the weasel family eat approximately 1/4 of their body weight every day. And you probably remember fondly the last time you ate 100 hamburgers in one day. We've learned through DNA metabarcoding and another study that's trying to look at these scats that are collected by the detection dog teams, what martens and these other carnivores are eating. So certainly they eat chipmunks and ground squirrels. Red-backed voles is one of the most common marten prey items, but what is unique to the coastal martens are birds, and particularly birds like varied thrush and birds that eat berries. We found that martens also eat a significant amount of berries, particularly those of salal. They are also finally closely related to salal, probably because they offer significant cover. Martens avoid openings, as far as we can tell. This was done on a montane study, but it's over 1,000 times less likely for them to come near or within an opening of any size. They also avoid thinned areas for fuel and fire treatments. So this could be a challenge in the future. And the reason why is they can get eaten by almost anything: bobcats, barred owls, great horned owls, coyotes, etc. So at the same time, we're trying to map where these other carnivore species exist and where they are predicted to occupy. Similarly, we're using that same DNA metabarcoding to identify what these predators are eating, and hopefully this is able to continue. It's quite expensive, certainly. And what we have found is marten DNA within, say, bobcat scats. so we have some validation of these concerns. So in summary, for Humboldt martens, we're using multifaceted approaches, many studies, and collaboration is a high priority to create this foundational knowledge and try to move it towards applied information. As I transition to Fisher, one thing I want you to notice really quickly is this particular marten has kind of a fox-like tail, light chestnut brown, that differs from, Fishers that are a bit darker brown or black uniformly. This is a kit, about 90 days old, trying to move a gray squirrel. Fishers are significantly larger. This particular kit is probably 2 times larger than a marten already. And they might interact more in managed stands. So both martens and Fishers use the landscape in a variety of ways. They den and have their kits only in cavities and trees and snags high above the ground typically. And we're trying to do a study to summarize which spatial scale is most important for Fishers. That is upcoming. We are also using GPS data to look at their movement and where they're resting. So this moving object is a Fisher, and it's taking locations every 15 minutes. So here you can see the Fisher is moving in and out of managed stands more often. And from these data, we can infer resting locations. And some of those resting locations, even maternal den sites, are in slash piles. Slash piles have been used for maternal dens, but not natal dens, where they would have, say, a small kit that's already mobile to rest and hide in one of these locations. Slash piles are used on some note by both Fishers and by martens, but we know not to what degree and how they're using the particular piles or when. So here, the last study I'm going to talk about, we are collecting data on small mammal bioenergetics in slash piles and in adjacent stands. And that's very unique because we'll be able to compare where small mammals are located within these stands and which particular small mammals martens and Fishers are eating using the DNA metabarcoding. Our second objective is to look at marten and Fisher occurrence near and within slash piles. And to do this, we're using a combination of remote cameras and detection dog teams. Finally, we are going to look towards a risk evaluation and concept paper, specifically on the topic of fire and wildlife use. And I'm very happy that Dr. John Bailey at Oregon State University is helping me co-mentor 2 graduate students, one focused on the slash pile project, the other focused on the red tree vole project, thanks to the Fish and Wildlife Habitat and Managed Forest Fund. Again, we have a lot of collaborators moving this project forward, and we're going to be doing more in the next few years. So with that, I've talked about a lot of projects. It's a puzzle to try to fit all of this information together. And science here is the foundation, or a foundation, but I would really like to emphasize that it takes a diversity of dedicated people that are truly engaged, including many like yourselves, to try to take this information and apply it on the landscape. And that conversation needs to be continued in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And we do have a little bit of time for questions. And so I really appreciate your comment about this, about needing to work together and take this information out of the landscape. So if you were managing all the land in Oregon, what would the #1 thing that you'd ask landowners to do for these species? And it's different for each one probably. So that if someone was like, you know what, I want red tree voles everywhere, or maybe their focus is the marten, what's the top thing in your wish list that they could do?
It differs for each of the 3 species, so that might be challenging. For red tree voles, I think, well, first I think the #1 priority that I'd love landowners to do is to engage, because they're on the ground and they have observations that we probably need. We don't know where all the animals are. If they were going to manage for the species in particular, I think we should worry about structural retention, having structures that retain older characteristics through time, like nesting and denning habitat. and being able to have connectivity. And those are challenging, and they would all be very specific.
And then one more for you. So if Pacific martens have such a wide range, how do we explain that they're only finding them in limited areas? Do they extend beyond the areas that are mapped, or help us understand where we think they are versus where the range is?
Yeah, so these animals have a prior range and distribution, but at the current day and age, we've only found them in 4 populations, one of which completely was burned in 2020, like an entire population. And the split between Pacific martens and Humboldt martens on the coast, I forget exactly, it's like 1.6 million years ago. So they're unique to Pacific martens, which are in the mountain range. I could say a lot more, but it would get into a lot of details. Right now, I think they're restricted, potentially between a combination of predators, lack of food, and landscape characteristics.
That's great. Thank you, Katie. I'm going to save the remaining questions for the full panel, and we'll give Claudine her full time. So I'll invite Claudine to come on now. Hi, Claudine.
Hello.
Hi, glad you're here. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to talk about, Claudine is from Port Blakely, and she's here to talk about the way that the forests are managed for Port Blakely. And you guys won't believe this, but my dog is making so much noise. Claudine, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited to be here today, and what a fabulous panel. So really awesome information being shared here today, and so excited to be part of it. Thanks to Julie and Fran and the whole committee for persevering to put this all together. I know it's been an extremely tough year, and to make the decision to push forward with this, I know a lot of work went into it, so thank you. Port Blakely has been working on this HCP for 4 years, so we've just been rolling it out slowly over the last year, and it's really a neat opportunity to be here today with you to share it with you as well. I'm going to cover a few things during this presentation. I want to share a little bit about who Port Blakely is and what is this HCP, along with the stewardship agreement, and why the heck are we going through all the effort to pursue one. I'll share a little bit about the conservation strategy and what we're doing. You'll hear a lot about the themes you've heard today during the wildlife panel, because we tried to incorporate as much of this science as we could into developing our conservation strategy. And then, as this was intended to be a virtual tour and we were all supposed to be in the field together having this discussion, we tried something a little bit different, and we'll try that out with you today as a virtual tour. And you can provide feedback to us about how that worked after the presentation and see if that was helpful or not. And then we'll talk about next steps with the HCP and what it's going to look like to get this thing across the finish line. And at the end, of course, there'll be opportunity for questions. So I also just want to say that when we were going to be in the field doing this together, you are going to get to hear from the full host of Port Blakely staff on this project, and they are great staff, and there's been a tremendous amount of work that's gone into this plan. So I'm sorry that they're not here with you today. Also, I know we have some folks that are logged into the presentation, but we have 12 minutes instead of half of a day to share all of this with you. So we hope that we'll get to see you out on a landing sometime in the future, and you can get the broader perspective of the story from all of our perspectives at Port Blakely. But I'm going to start out here giving you a little bit of history about the company. We started in 1864. That was 5 generations ago. And Bainbridge Island, we had a mill, Port Blakely Mill Company up on Bainbridge Island. That's in Puget Sound across from Seattle. And they were in the shipbuilding business for a while. The mill burned down several times and they rebuilt it. The Port Blakely family bought the company in the early 1900s and built a railroad line called the Blakely Grade because they needed to be able to move more forest products to the mill. They also had a barging system up and down Puget Sound to get wood from the Blakely Grade up into the mill. So Port Blakely has been around in this region as one of the early colonizers of this area, for better or worse. And we're 5 generations in now from a family-owned business perspective. And we still have 2 family members that are working for the company today, our CEO of Port Blakely and also our president of U.S. Forestry. So stewardship values run really deep in the company, and as a family-owned business, we have the opportunity to do things a little bit different. And so that's what this HCP is all about, is creating the ability for us to manage our land the way that we think is the right way, without having to have the concerns or fears that regulations are going to change and shift on us over time. It enables us to have a long-term plan for forest management that we can rely on. So that involves a lot of different things, right? A lot of the things we've talked about today, as well as making sure that forest products can keep moving, that jobs are stable in our communities, making sure that family owners are financially rewarded for their investment. This is super important to us because we know that their investment is a choice, and we want forestry to be a great green investment for the family. So we're trying to do our best to figure out how to balance all the stewardship values, the need for good protections and conservation for wildlife, making sure, you know, one of the Port Blakely values is that if we have spotted owls or murrelets nesting on our land, that it's actually a benefit, not something that we want to prevent from happening. And so these types of HCPs and CCAAs, there's another one, a safe harbor agreement. These all give us tools as ways to bridge these gaps and figure out ways to do win-wins between doing good things for conservation and wildlife, while also making sure that the business is economically viable and the family is benefited from their investment. So another piece of that is ensuring that our forests are as resilient as possible. This is more important than ever as we're looking at the pressures of climate change, and of course now the recent wildfires. So having some different elements in our forest practices to try to increase the resilience of our forests is something that is front and foremost for us right now, as well as for a lot of other businesses, of course, in the region. So you've heard a little bit about what a habitat conservation plan is from Paul earlier today. And there's a couple going on in the state of Oregon as well, the Elliott and the Western Forest State HCP. But I'll just give you a little bit of feedback here on what it is and why Port Blakely is interested in pursuing it. So essentially, it's a relationship with the federal permitting agencies, and this is not just U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but also NOAA Fisheries, because we're also working with listed salmon species that are in our rivers and streams. And we've worked very closely with them over the last 4 years to develop this plan together. And they've been fabulous partners and collaborators to develop, I think, a solid plan. We've also consulted with the Oregon Department of Forestry and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. They've been instrumental as well in providing us feedback from the state forest practices perspective, as well as the local knowledge of the wildlife. Fish and Wildlife has been really helpful with helping us kind of get focused in on what's important and what's really known about the state of the species at the local level. So these plans are voluntary. Port Blakely has 2 federal agreements up in Washington, an HCP and a safe harbor agreement. Our first one was signed in 1996. So we have learned a ton about these plans and what we think works about them and what we think doesn't work. We've incorporated a lot of that knowledge into how we developed this plan. So we feel a little bit seasoned in this process, and it's exciting to be able to do this process for our Oregon forest lands. Along those lines, it's extremely site specific to our forest lands. I'll show you a map here in a couple slides, and you'll get to see about where we're at. And we developed this plan according to the wildlife and the resources that we have across our landscape. So it wouldn't be necessarily the right plan to build for everybody, because anybody that was interested in doing a plan like this would need to look at what the wildlife issues, presence, what do you have, what are your features that you have, your aquatic resources, what are your terrestrial resources, what are your objectives. So that is really site specific to each landowner, and you get to build your plan around those things, which is really exciting and fun. And it takes a long time. It takes some grit as well, I'd say, to get through the collaborative process. But in the end, it's really worth it to be able to do things the way in a way that represents whoever it is that owns your company. And for us, that's the Port Blakely family. It does take going above and beyond current regulations. You got to give something now to get something over the long term. And for us, it was a pretty easy trade-off because we really see in the long term, it's going to be a huge benefit to us to be able to manage the land the way that we want to without those concerns about shifting regulations. And what it all amounts to is an incidental take permit, which is essentially a permit that allows us to have some take of endangered species as long as what we're doing is otherwise lawful. And so in our opinion, we are creating in forestry a shifting habitat mosaic. And if we remove some habitat in some places, we know we're growing it in other places. And so over the life of the plan, the habitat is shifting across the landscape. And if there is some take of endangered species in that mosaic, we know that we're creating a conservation benefit for them in other areas. Of course, we would never intend to do a take. However, sometimes there's things in the forest that we don't always see, as we know. So it provides us that regulatory certainty in that we know what we're doing is the best thing that we can do, and we've gone through the process to build this permit together to get to this point. And we're pretty excited that this is the first multi-species forestry HCP in Oregon, and perhaps it will help pave the way for other HCPs that are now in development. The stewardship agreement is a similar but different agreement. This one is with the Oregon Department of Forestry. It has a lot of the same provisions as the federal HCP, being that it's voluntary and flexible. It also has to exceed Oregon forest practice rules and it's long term. The main difference is that it gives us protection might not be the right word. It gives us an increased level of regulatory stability for Oregon forest practice rules, whereas the federal HCP is more associated with Federal Endangered Species Act rules. So Oregon is really neat that it has that provision for an Oregon level plan as well as a federal level plan. Well, working in Washington was not so smooth on that front, and so this was a neat opportunity. It also includes operational efficiencies, which includes things like a streamlined notification system for our foresters to make their life a little bit easier. But of course, there is a reporting and auditing and compliance component of that as well. But overall, our operations are streamlined, which makes things a little bit smoother from that perspective. This map shows the proximity of Port Blakely's forest lands that are under the plan. You can see where Estacada there is. The northern part of the property here is about 12 miles south of the Portland boundary, metropolitan boundary. So that kind of explains this interface that we see here coming from the northwest, this rural agricultural interface from the northwest, and then from the southeast we see more industrial forest lands and federal lands in the foothills of the Cascades. So we're kind of in this interesting position where we're in like a transition habitat zone. And so we think that this land possibly has a unique and important role for wildlife in these habitats. There's a lot of dispersal potential, distribution potential, and we definitely just want to keep this land in forestry. I guess that's the main point, is we think this land is important to be in forestry and we want to keep it in forestry. So the clear cut is a pretty small portion of the forest land landscape overall. Both our HCP and our stewardship agreement are landscape level plans. They focus on the landscape level habitat mosaic. And so all of the ages of the forest provide different habitat for different species at different times, and they're managed accordingly. We do a commercial thin program, we do a pre-commercial thin program, and then we do our regeneration harvest program. So our HCP and our stewardship agreement talk about all those different elements of the landscape level habitat management, but the main focus is on what is done at regeneration harvest. Even though we like to think about it more in the big picture, the details are important as well. And so that's really what we're going to focus on for the virtual part of the tour. But first, I'll give you a few more details about what goes into an HCP and some of the considerations that are really important as an HCP is developed. So the baseline condition, this will come up again later towards the end of the presentation. But starting out with this HCP, we identified that we have 188 miles of streams. This includes both fish and non-fish streams. It includes, Oregon's got a classification for SSBT streams, that's salmon, steelhead, and bull trout. It includes the non-fish streams are both perennial and seasonal. So you can already get the feeling, and you already know probably, that there are lots of different ways that streams are classified. Those streams function in different ways, and different species utilize those streams during different parts of their life cycle. And so just having a good understanding of that was important as we developed our aquatic conservation strategy. We have second and third growth forest stands, 0 to 70 years old. We were definitely in that classification with 0 to none older forests greater than 120 years old that came up earlier. And we have adjacent spotted owls. So we don't have any on our lands that we know of, but we have some adjacent to us, and they're an important species that we would want to welcome onto our lands, not feel like we were penalized if we had them on our lands. And so we developed this plan in hopes that if they wanted to disperse through us and have a snack along the way, that would be fabulous. And we're going to continue to do surveys for them. So in the case that they do show up on our lands, that we have a plan for their protection. Covered activities. So this is a really important part of an HCP. An important part is identifying and describing what it is that we're doing that might cause a take or reduce habitat. And so this is typical forest management activities, including timber harvest, silvicultural activities, all the way from planting trees. We did not include herbicides as part of our plan. That really complicated things from the analysis perspective. So this plan does not cover any use of chemicals, but it includes all other elements of silviculture. And it includes a pretty big component for road management. And that includes addressing fish barrier issues with culverts. It addresses sedimentation. It addresses managing for sediment, and that includes cross drains, ditches, and good substrate on the roads. So that was a pretty big part of this plan, because we think it's important for maintaining the aquatic habitat, having a good road management plan. We essentially have two approaches to our conservation strategy. The first one is a focus on the species themselves. So this plan includes strategies for 21 species. And this includes Endangered Species Act, listed species and unlisted species. These are species that could potentially be sensitive to forest management. And they're all species that are known to live or could live in our forests. Not all of them are there now. We don't have fisher there now. We don't have gray wolf there now. But we think that our habitat is suitable enough for them that they could be there in the future. And so we included these species in the case that they do come, and we have provisions for them if they do come. The other approach to our conservation strategy is a focus on habitat and habitat function in particular. So focusing on the aquatic and terrestrial habitat features that might be most likely to be utilized by wildlife. So we have protections of all of our aquatic habitats, even if they are up in the uplands or they don't have fish. We recognize that they have a really important function for amphibians and other species. Like all wildlife need fresh water, right? So we have protections for all of our aquatic features. In addition, we have special protections for unique or ecologically sensitive terrestrial habitats. This includes legacy features, whether they be standing or on the ground, legacy live trees, legacy snags, which are really tricky because you often get hit with L&I standards for safety, which of course is our top priority. But we leave these things where we can. And then downwoody debris. So even during our commercial fin activities, we're intentionally creating snags and leaving downwoody debris. We're trying to build up that downwoody debris component. And then if we have legacy features, as part of our plan, we retain those as well where they exist, where it's not a safety concern. So the next part of the presentation is going to show you what this turns out to look like a little bit on the landscape. This is a large fish stream with some seeps. This video is actually of a unit that was harvested prior to us signing the HCP and the stewardship agreement. Actually, the HCP is not signed yet. So apologies, I wish it was, but it's not. The stewardship agreement is signed. It was signed in February of this year. But this video is of a stand that was actually harvested before that. I'm gonna test something here. What you can see, this is a 100-foot buffer on each side of the stream. And what you can see is some areas where the forest comes out around some seeps and special sites that are associated with the stream. So it creates a variable width buffer, but it's focused on retaining structure around the sites that have the most chance of having a function, a higher biological function. And so this is kind of an example of what those buffers might look like in terms of variable width, where the minimum width is 100 feet, but you might see some pop-outs that protect sensitive sites that are associated with the stream. This is the virtual part of the tour. Oops. Okay. So inside our riparian buffers, I wanted to give you a peek of what some of these look like. On the left, you are seeing a managed non-fish perennial buffer. So for our non-fish perennial streams, we have a prescription of a 50-foot managed buffer where we can remove a portion of the forest from the outer 25 feet. And so this image on the left, it gives you a sense of what that looks like. So you still have an intact forest, and then you have a managed zone where there's more light coming in, but there's still some structure there as well. On the right, you see a non-fish buffer, an example of a non-fish buffer. These are unmanaged buffers, and we classified our stream still as small, medium, and large, and it applies to all fish. So even sculpin and lamprey are covered under this plan as fish, and all fish are the same. A sculpin is the same as a bull trout for us in this plan. And so these are unmanaged buffers. I would say that most of our buffers fit the gap dynamic stage that Ashley was talking about earlier. You see a conifer and a hardwood component. These are second growth forests that have been retained over time. And they were narrower as part of our plan before we signed the stewardship agreement, but now going forward, we're harvesting under that plan. And so we have these wider unmanaged forests now for all of our fish streams. Our aquatic part of the strategy is multifaceted as well. We will be putting large woody debris into small and medium fish streams when we are doing an associated management. And so we're going to be trying to learn as much as we can from Dave Stewart and David Bugni as far as how they did this restoration in the most effective possible ways. We've had David Stewart out on our land several times to help us learn this piece. This has not been our expertise in the past, but we want to do this in the way that's most meaningful. And there's a lot to learn in this space as far as, we know we're in the long game, but we still want to make sure we're getting these pieces in the channel in ways that can function. So it's streams that are in need of large woody debris. So it's not necessarily all streams, but most streams seem that they could really benefit from it. So we do that. We're actively restoring streams when we're managing next to them. And then as part of that as well, we're contributing to local restoration projects in our watersheds. And so we're working with some of the watershed councils and with Dave Stewart as well to identify projects that might be, might benefit. And so as part of the HCP, we will be actively contributing towards watershed projects on an annual basis for the life of the plan. So as part of our terrestrial habitat, we have employed upland habitat patches as part of the strategy. And our wildlife leaf tree requirement is 4 trees per acre. Under current forest practices, it's 2 trees per acre. So we've doubled it. And then we said that 25% of those trees will be left in the uplands. And our preference is for habitat patches that are 1/4 acre or more. And we want them around sensitive sites like wetlands, seeps, legacy features, unique trees, unique habitats that might be in these areas. Our intent here is to optimize on what is already diverse and functioning in these areas. So this is the conservation protective level. Let me try this here.
And
so there's
Claudine,
a conservation.
You've got about 3 minutes left. Max.
Okay. So there's a conservation element and also a restoration element. So that's a habitat, upland habitat patch. There's another upland habitat patch. It's providing more of the connectivity piece to adjacent habitat types. Here's a peek in what the interior of these habitat patches look like. Really an effort to retain that understory diversity. Here's another one. These next ones will go pretty quick because they're just giving you a view of what some of these structures look like. Here we have some created structures as well as some retained structures. These are some of our upland wildlife trees as well. More created snags. Also, you can see the slash distribution on the forest floor. This is a fairly small legacy snag, but it was retained and we're happy about it. Biodens. So we often have a product that is not useful to us economically, and we disperse some of them and we pile some of them. And the intent here is to recover some of the structure of the older legacy features that we no longer have. 8% of our land was in agriculture before it was converted back into forestry. And so we're piling some of this stuff. We have fisher and wolf as covered species, and someday if they're there and they need a place to den, then maybe this would be suitable. We don't know. We don't have any data on that. We're just trying to figure out ways to get some structure out on the landscape. Here's an example of some of our road infrastructure. As I mentioned, that is an important part of our management plan. This project would not be possible without a lot of collaborators, not just at the federal and state agencies, but we have met with a lot of interested parties, more than 150 over the last 2 years. And so we've received fabulous feedback, tons of good suggestions, lots of collaboration. We've incorporated what we've learned into the plan to make it a better plan. But alas, I'm gonna just kind of tie this up here. Port Blakely was hit with our recent wildfires, the Riverside and Beachy Creek wildfires. And so we had actually submit our final HCP on August 20th, and the fires occurred on September 8th. So it is a bit of a setback for our HCP process. We're definitely having to revise our baseline conditions. So those baseline conditions that I said were 0 to 70 years old and 188 miles of stream, our stream miles didn't change, but our inventory has changed. And so we're taking a minute to assess the damage, and then we'll figure out how to get that updated information into the HCP. But we are resilient, as is the land, and we have a way through this. So here's just a short list of things that we're going to need to get done. A short list. What you don't see in this short list is all the reiterations and all the collaborations and the discussions and the edits and the revisions. But we're hoping to get this across the finish line in the next few months, get the revised HCP to the federal agencies, and hopefully early next year, it will indeed make it out to public comment. And even further next year, hopefully we'll actually get a permit. So appreciate your time. I hope I didn't go too far over, Fran.
You went a little over, but it was so fascinating that it's totally fine. I'll invite all our panelists back, but while they're turning their cameras on and getting ready, Claudine, could you tell us when you were developing the Oregon HCP, what level was ODF involved? Was that at the district level or was it at the Salem office?
It was Salem. Yeah.
Okay.
So we consulted with the district foresters because they have the local knowledge and they've been the ones that have worked with our Oregon team. So they were fabulous partners, but we worked with the Salem team out of the incentives office and they were fabulous.
That's great. Jake, I've got a question for you on fire from the audience. Will you have enough information and records about the site prep and vegetation management practices to look at the fire severity for those, or anything beyond fire severity for the retained structures project?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we did not retain the site prep spray records for this particular study, although we do have vegetation sampling that occurred in the first year following harvest in each of these sites at a very detailed level. So we've got what the vegetation community was coming up, and again, another point in 2018. What we do know, and we can certainly probably go back from the individual companies as they're interested in this topic potentially, and get those spray records. These sites were all planted with 1+ seedlings and at roughly 400 to 450 trees per acre. So we know generally that, we know their age, and we've got some detailed vegetation information, but not the actual herbicide application records at this point.
Thank you. Claudine, with the wider riparian management areas across the fish and non-fish streams in your habitat conservation plan, do you know what the percentages of your total ownership that is within the riparian management areas, and is that shareable information?
It's going to be variable over time because our harvest plan from year to year is very dynamic, and it's also associated with our Washington estate. So Port Blakely owns lands in Washington and Oregon, and we manage the whole estate as one. And so the data that we have about our riparian management zones actually rolls up to a broad number that's averaged out across Oregon and Washington. So we don't have the exact number for Oregon, but we think it's somewhere between 9 and 14%.
Well, that's great. So Katie, thinking about those martens and how hard they are to find, how confident are you about knowing where they are?
That's a great question. We are confident that we were able to identify all the populations that persist in Oregon and Northern California, but we certainly miss individual martens with our methods. So we try to keep our survey sites independent such that this marten could not be detected at this station. So to be very confident, you'd have to do a lot more.
Right, that makes sense to me. Okay, I have kind of a two-part question. One of it's just mine, and I think this is for Jake. It's about the retention patches, and I noticed in your presentation you talked about how the small patches are more valuable than an individual tree, which you and I have talked about before because as you know, I work with my landowners all over Washington and Oregon, mostly Oregon, and really ask for those single wildlife trees to be left across the landscape, and can give a number of reasons why I think they're important. But this question relates to that, so I want you to talk about that for a minute. And then did you happen to notice in that study any use by woodpeckers in the created snags, and if so, what species did you happen to notice?
Sure, yeah, so those are both good questions. And so we haven't actually gotten to the portion of the study yet where we're going to go back and look at cavity nesting bird use of the created snags. There has been a large Weyerhaeuser study that has been conducted looking at created snag use and in and around the Springfield and Cottage Grove tree farms. And AJ Kroll was an author on those papers, as well as Matt Haney. And so we can get a sense from that of who we're going to expect to see to move in, and we also get a sense from that these snags typically have kind of an operational window for cavity nesting birds of between 5 and 15 years post-harvest. So they need to rot a little bit. They're hard as a rock when you first leave them out there. They need to decay about 5 years, and then by about 15 years they're getting covered up by the surrounding stand, and so then they begin to lose use after that point. So it is kind of a moving window, 10 out of your potential 40-year rotation, that they really add value to the site, and a number of different cavity nesters that use them. And Fran, I'll never dissuade people from leaving wildlife trees. The idea that however, if you're leaving kind of a straight, you know, whatever size DBH tree in the middle of your unit that doesn't have unique characteristics, I think it would be better in general to leave those in small clumps than to leave them individually. However, that's a gross simplification that includes all kinds of things, like they might blow down and have, you know, value as downwood, et cetera. So.
Right, there's lots of site-specific considerations, but thank you for putting that plug in for me. All right, Claudine, I've got another question for you about your HCP. And are you able to share how that impacts your harvest planning, harvest levels, and costs associated with managing the plan on this size of tree farm? That's a tough one.
We think it's making our life easier. Basically, the HCP and the stewardship agreement are giving us the set of conditions that we created for ourselves and that our partners have agreed to at the state and federal levels. So we actually think that we're going to have more stability in our long-term management because we can predict what it's going to, we can't predict the markets, of course, but we can plan out our management strategy. So we think it'll be streamlined in terms of costs. We think it'll be streamlined in terms of planning. And the only thing that's not predictable is the markets, along with everyone else trying to figure that out.
Right, absolutely. And it's all pretty scary situation right now, right? We're trying to figure that out. Katie, we had a question. You mentioned the den sites and difference between a maternal and natal den site in those slash units. And I'm not sure everybody understands the difference between a maternal and natal den site.
Sure. A natal den is where a fish or a marten gives birth. So that's where the kits, when they're helpless, will remain. And those are exclusively in cavities. Natal den, a maternal den is anywhere where a mother and her kits reside. So the kits could be playing, moving around, much more active, much more self-sufficient. And those maternal dens include the areas where we have slash piles.
Great.
So it's just a little bit different. If you don't have natal dens, then you have no fish or kits.
Right. I think that's an important distinction. Thank you for that. Jake, I've got a question for you. Kind of when we've been talking about pivoting our research now with all the forest fires that we've had, do you know if there's any plans to study various methods of fuel reduction in terms of how that might affect wildlife and combating the forest fires?
Yeah, there's certainly been a lot of work on that already, and we're kind of gearing up for potentially taking on some novel questions within the recently burned sites, including addressing how those fires have influenced some experimental studies that already had data collection ongoing, including some of Ashley's work in the riparian alternative buffer arrangements study. And then I'll also mention quickly the work that Katie Moriarty may have discussed just a little bit about slash piles, and continuing on that vein with John Bailey, and John, I believe, is going to take on with the graduate student on that project kind of a modeling of fire dynamics based on potential slash pile retention. So that'll be a part of that study. There's quite a bit of work, as I think probably many of you are aware, regarding fuels treatments and their effect on wildlife. I did a meta-analysis study of thinning, including fuels treatment thinning in 2011, and kind of analyzed that over about 25 or 30 different studies that had occurred, and generally found positive effects of fuels treatment thinning. Specifically, that one was kind of the most positive in terms of wildlife response across 5 different taxonomic groups.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you all our panelists for your presentations today and being part of this virtual OSAF meeting. We really appreciate your contributions and the time that you shared with us today. And that's all the time we have for the question and answers. So thank you for all the participants for putting those questions in for us and making the job of a moderator easy by having those questions. And so I hope we get to see you all in person soon. And Julie, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Fran. And it's a little quiet, so I'll try and give the clap there for all 111 people that have been watching. I need a much bigger, like at the sports arena where they've been having the audience fill in with clapping. I feel like we were missing that at the end of each presentation. So definitely a big thank you to all the presenters this morning, and not only getting your presentation, but you went out in the field with a photographer and tried to bring that in. And I think that was awesome to bring the field into this. So really appreciate all that time and all that you all did. So thank you very much. And we are, oh, Fran, I can see you wanna.
I forgot to give them the code, the certified. Yeah, let me just give that. I'm so sorry, really quick. So for those of you collecting continuing education credits, the code is OSAF, the number 4 solutions. And do caps matter, Julie?
I think Mick will probably be all right with whatever way it does, but we'll put it in the chat there too for that. So
Cool.
definitely.
And then for certified wildlife biologists, this also counts for continuing education credits. But as many of you know, for that, you just need to fill out that form when you're reapplying for your continue your status with that. So if you have questions about it, just contact me and I'll help.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thanks again, Fran, and the whole team. And I really appreciate a lot of great information.